This is it! The ultimate dimension for restin' stories, and it's called Sleepy Myths.
Something stirred in the garage that night, soft, almost imperceptible, like a breath brushing against the edges of thought. The lights were dim, the tools asleep, and the hum of forgotten inventions hung thick in the air like dust caught in sunlight, or perhaps like memory itself, quiet and waiting. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from and what time is it there? Now take a moment to get cozy. Grab your warm drink if you like, wrap yourself in blankets and welcome yourself. And welcome to my little corner of stories to Sleepy Myths. If you enjoy drifting into soft worlds with me, consider liking and subscribing, so these gentle tales can reach more wandering hearts. And now let's begin. Rick was there, as he often was in these nights that blurred into one another, hunched over a workbench scattered with glass, metal, and the faint smell of burnt ozone. His hands moved automatically, touching knobs and dials he could no longer remember installing, yet his mind wandered elsewhere, to a faint memory of a child he often overlooked in favor of stars and equations. Morty slept upstairs unaware, though perhaps even in sleep, he carried some measure of anticipation for the rare glimpses of softness that came from his grandfather. The garage breathed quietly, shadows curling against walls like lazy smoke, and in that hush something unspoken flickered. A knock, gentle and hollow, echoed through the metal-lined room. Not a person, but a memory tapping on the edge of the mind. Rick paused, listening. He did not move toward it. He simply stayed where he was, letting the sound settle like a pebble dropped into still water. In that moment, the difference between genius and love became visible to him, not in a sudden revelation, but in the small, quiet weight pressing against his chest. The glow of a single overlooked lamp bathed the room in soft amber, reflecting off the metallic edges of unfinished machines. Somewhere in the corner, a jar vibrated faintly, as though it contained a heartbeat, not glass. He remembered the first time he had wanted to be a perfect grandfather and realized that he didn't know how. The memory was not sharp, but it hummed in the garage like a tune half-remembered, soft as starlight filtering through clouds. Morty's small round face appeared in his mind, the echo of a laugh that had not yet been spoken, the warmth of a hand held for no reason other than that it was there. Rick exhaled slowly, almost without realizing it, and the silence seemed kind, the hum of machines no longer demanding attention but offering companionship. There was a strange warmth flickering in the air, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he could leave the world a little gentler than he had found it. Rick's eyes drifted to a small door in the corner, the edges worn, the paint chipped. He remembered the night he first opened it, how it had revealed the possibility of a different kind of invention, one not built to protect, not built to escape, but built to hold a moment, a person, a memory safe. He didn't open it now. Instead, he let his mind wander to the first time he realized that moments could be broken, and that love, unlike equations, did not solve itself. A faint glow seemed to hover behind the door, soft and persistent, and for the first time that night, Rick wondered if even he could be careful enough to let it matter. From the corner of the room, a small device buzzed faintly, more alive than its circuits should have allowed. He remembered Morty tapping it curiously, asking questions Rick couldn't answer. Questions about why light could be warm, why silence could be comforting, why sometimes being present was harder than building a starship. Rick's hands rested against the worn wood of the bench, and for a long while he did not move. He did not fix the device. He simply listened to it, to the faint murmur of the universe, and allowed himself a quiet sigh that sounded like relief, like a memory letting go of its edges. The hum of machines and the soft whisper of air mingled, stretching the seconds into a gentle eternity. Rick thought of Morty again, imagining his small body curled up in bed, the rise and fall of his chest marking the passage of a peaceful, unhurried night. He remembered that sometimes, the smallest gestures, a look, a hand held, a pancake made despite burning, could carry the weight of galaxies, quietly, without announcement. That night, he thought, perhaps those moments were the only true experiments worth keeping. A drawer shifted softly, and from it, a faint light escaped. Rick glanced down to see a tiny, cracked orb, pulsing gently with an inner glow, as though it had survived the collapse of a universe and now wanted only to be remembered. He picked it up and held it, the warmth creeping into his fingers, and allowed himself a single unguarded thought. This might be enough. Not solutions, not corrections, not greatness. Just enough. Enough to whisper that care, when given quietly, could last longer than anything else. The night stretched onward, the garage alive in gentle quiet. Shadows moved with the hum of forgotten instruments, the light of a solitary lamp soft against metal and wood. Rick's mind lingered on possibilities that didn't need equations, outcomes that didn't need calculations. In that soft, immeasurable hour, he realized that love wasn't about knowing how or doing perfectly or always protecting. Sometimes it was simply being present, simply listening, simply letting warmth exist without demanding explanation. He placed the orb back into the drawer, not hidden, not lost, but resting, breathing alongside the inventions, alongside the memories. Outside, the stars began to lean into dawn, the faintest colors bleeding across the sky. Rick stood in silence, letting the morning creep toward him, letting the quiet persist, letting the memory of being gentle settle into the space between inventions. He thought quietly that maybe Morty would never know, and maybe that was the point. Love, after all, could exist in absence, in half-remembered glows, in the small spaces between action and reflection. And so the garage exhaled, not with machinery, not with calculation, but with something softer, something alive, something remembered. Rick remained, hands at rest, heart quietly aware, letting the hum of the world wash over him. Outside the day began, but inside, in the glow of the first, gentle warmth behind the door, time seemed to pause. Just for a moment, enough to let care unspoken and unmeasured feel enough. The memory of that planet drifted through Rick's mind like smoke caught in a quiet morning. It was a planet so small, so delicate, that it could have been mistaken for nothing more than a speck of dust in the vastness of space, yet to Rick and Morty, it held the weight of entire worlds. He remembered shaping it with hands both steady and hesitant, pressing craters and valleys into existence, planting oceans that whispered and mountains that hummed like soft lullabies. This planet was a gift made of curiosity and fragments of regret, a tiny world where Morty could wander without danger, where laughter could bloom freely, and the quiet hum of existence might feel like home. Rick had never told anyone about it, not because he wanted secrecy, but because the planet's importance was private, a delicate bloom in a garden no one else could enter. In the memory, Rick floated beside Morty, observing him as he bounced lightly over hills made of starlight dust, laughing at the way the ground seemed to tickle his tiny feet. The boy's laughter was small, faint, yet infinitely resonant, like a bell ringing through empty corridors of forgotten labs. Rick watched him, tracing the contours of his face with eyes that saw not just the child before him, but all the shadows of childhood that he had once carried alone. Morty's hair shimmered in the soft luminescence of the planet, golden threads catching light like fragile flames, and for a long while, Rick allowed himself the luxury of wonder, the simple, unguarded awe of seeing someone grow in safety. The planet itself seemed alive, breathing with the rhythm of the boy's footsteps. Tiny trees leaned toward him as he passed, leaves rustling in soft acknowledgement. Rivers sparkled faintly, reflecting the faint glow of distant stars, and mountains exhaled quietly, letting the wind carry whispers of the first time Rick had hoped to be more than just a scientist, more than just someone capable of building or breaking universes, but someone who could hold care in his hands. In the quiet of the memory, Rick realized how fragile that hope had been, yet how enduring, like the planet itself, small but infinitely significant. Morty's laughter slowed as he paused to look at Rick, eyes half closed in sleepy wonder, the corners of his mouth softening into a small, genuine smile. Rick caught himself, noticing for the first time that this boy, this echo of his own blood and curiosity, had grown into someone capable of holding light even in the shadow of worlds collapsing. There was no need for words. The silence between them was heavy with understanding. Rick realized that love, in its truest form, did not always speak. It hovered in the space between glances, lingered in the warmth of shared breaths, and persisted quietly, like the steady pulse of the planet under their feet. They walked across valleys carved from memory and hope, rivers shimmering with reflections of their unspoken thoughts. Rick noticed the way Morty's hands moved, brushing gently against the soft grass, tracing patterns in the soil as if to anchor himself to this tiny, perfect world. And in that moment, Rick understood. The planet had never been about protection or escape. It had been about presence. It had been about allowing a small, fragile existence to feel real and safe, to be witnessed without interruption. The idea of building something so small yet infinite in emotional weight struck him deeply. The horizon stretched endlessly, folding into soft clouds that glimmered faintly like powdered starlight. Rick watched as Morty climbed a hill that rose subtly from the center of the planet, each step deliberate, each movement unhurried. The boy's laughter mingled with the hum of the world, creating a music of its own, a lullaby woven from curiosity, care, and innocence. Rick's chest tightened with a quiet awareness of what he had failed to express in the waking universe, a longing that neither shame nor pride could quiet. Sometimes, he thought, the most profound acts of love are invisible, unnoticed, except by the heart that gives and receives them. Rick floated closer to Morty, letting gravity, or perhaps the memory itself, hold them gently. He studied the boy's profile as the wind carried soft echoes from distant corners of the planet, whispers of moments, never spoken aloud. He imagined the small heartbeat of this world, the gentle pulse of safety and curiosity, and for a fleeting instant, he allowed himself to believe that maybe he had done something right. That maybe in some hidden corner of the cosmos, a planet could bear witness to love unmeasured by failure or error, and in doing so, teach him what it meant to simply be present. Time on the small planet felt different. There was no urgency, no ticking of clocks or hum of experiments demanding attention. The seconds stretched into minutes and the minutes into gentle hours, yet each carried the weight of eternity. Rick noticed the detail of every blade of grass, the shimmer of every tiny stream, the faint luminescence in the air that seemed to respond to Morty's joy. Each element of this memory, created from equal parts care and sorrow, vibrated quietly, like a star holding itself against the darkness. The planet seemed to fold around them, embracing them in a calm, undemanding gravity, reminding Rick that even in his chaotic life, moments of stillness were possible. As night approached on the small planet, if a memory could have a night, Rick and Morty lay side by side on a soft hill, the stars above glimmering faintly. Rick allowed himself a rare thought. Perhaps this was what he had been searching for all along. Not a formula, not a portal, not another universe to fix or escape. Just this, quiet companionship, the shared weight of existence, and the gentle, unwavering light of a small planet built from care. Morty yawned, curling slightly into himself, and Rick watched him, noticing the subtle rise and fall of the boy's chest. There was no expectation here, no measure of success, only presence, only observation, only love that needed no words. The planet hummed softly beneath them, a quiet witness to their shared eternity. Rick felt the memory settle in his chest like a gentle warmth, one that lingered beyond the edges of thought. For the first time in a long while, he did not think about equations, machines, or universes at risk. He only thought about the small boy beside him, and the fragile, perfect planet they had discovered together. The moment stretched outward, infinite yet contained, a lullaby of existence that neither needed to be spoken nor understood fully. And so they remained there, on that tiniest of planets, floating gently in the boundless memory of all Rick had built and all Morty had lived. The soft echo of laughter and starlight intertwined, and in the quiet, Rick realized some planets, some moments, are built not to be seen or saved by the universe, but to be felt, remembered, and carried forward in the gentle gravity of love. Rick remembered the lab as it had appeared that night, dim, humming with faint blue light, filled with the quiet breath of machines that had learned to whisper instead of shout. He had been working alone, though alone had always felt relative in his life. For every invention, every portal, every glowing wire, there was an echo of someone he could have been, someone he could have guided, someone he might have protected. That night, it was Morty's safety that pressed against his chest like an invisible weight. He had built a clone. Not a weapon, not a companion for mischief, not a copy to compete with life's unpredictability. Just a clone, soft, fragile, and sleeping under glass, a promise in polymer and energy that someone somewhere would be kept safe if he could not manage it himself. The clone looked like Morty in every way that mattered, the tilt of the head, the way the small fingers curled around nothing, the soft rise and fall of a chest too young to carry the burden of choice. Rick watched for a long time, leaning on the edge of the console, eyes tracing the outlines of an innocent face he feared he could never fully protect. The lab itself seemed to lean in closer, the shadows quieting to listen, the blue hum deepening as if aware that something delicate and improbable had entered its realm. For once Rick allowed himself to imagine peace, not the fleeting kind found in dreams or equations, but the kind that could be held, tangible in the form of a tiny human who would never know harm unless it came through accident, mistake, or him. He remembered the way he had arranged the clone, laying a soft blanket beneath its sleeping form, adjusting the small temperature regulators to mimic the warmth of a home he hadn't often provided. The light in the room danced across its features, highlighting the innocence that had always been harder to notice in the real Morty, especially when the boy had grown accustomed to chaos. Rick had imagined it countless times before, a Morty untouched by accident, by misfortune, by the weight of understanding that comes too early in life. Here the clone was free, and Rick could watch quietly, without the urgent necessity to fix, to lecture, to run. As he leaned closer, Rick's mind wandered to the small moments he had missed. Morty's first successful science project, the nights he had laughed himself to sleep, the mornings filled with groggy, hopeful conversation that had gone unnoticed while Rick tinkered with universes that often demanded more than one life could afford. In the clone, he saw the distilled version of all those moments, preserved not for the universe's applause, but for the quiet triumph of being present. He let himself imagine Morty's hand reaching out in trust, and the clone's hand, mirroring it, offered a reflection of a bond he had spent years learning to recognize. It was strange and yet familiar, a small universe of reassurance contained within a glass case. Rick thought about what it meant to let someone sleep without fear. The clone, though artificial, breathed and pulsed in ways that mimicked life perfectly. Yet more importantly, it allowed Rick to step outside his usual self, the chaotic mind, the relentless engine of invention. He allowed his shoulders to relax, the tension of a lifetime of danger and responsibility draining into the quiet hum around him. For once he could simply observe, no alarms, no calculations, no interdimensional consequences to consider. The clone was safe. Morty, somewhere in the house, could be too, if only in imagination, if only in the delicate scaffolding of hope he built night after night. The lab held its breath. Time seemed to slow, as if the world outside had noticed the rare act of gentleness unfolding in the small chamber. Rick's eyes lingered on the clone's sleeping face, and he realized that protection wasn't about control or omnipotence. It was about presence, about giving someone the space to exist without fear, to dream without interference, to be noticed without expectation. In the lab's soft blue glow, Rick finally understood that this, more than any portal, any machine, any invention, was what he had been searching for. The quiet certainty that someone mattered enough to be kept safe, even in silence. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes, but the blue light never faltered. Rick remained leaning on the console, eyes tracing every contour of the sleeping clone, memorizing its details, its impossibility. He imagined Morty there, seeing the clone, understanding the unspoken promise that no matter the chaos, there would always be a corner of the universe where he was safe. And in that imagining, Rick felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in decades, the slow, luminous pulse of contentment, a gentle tide that rose in quiet acknowledgement of a life, however complicated, that still carried the capacity to care. Finally, Rick straightened, giving the clone a soft nod as if to say, "I see you. I am here." He did not move it, did not touch it further. There was no need. The presence alone was enough, the quiet assurance that someone somewhere would always notice, always remain vigilant, always bear witness. Rick turned away slowly, letting the hum of the lab settle back into its usual rhythm, yet carrying with him the soft resonance of the night of the clone, the night he allowed himself to dream of protection and of love, fragile but unbroken. The hum lingered after he left, like a lullaby that would not fade, reminding him that sometimes the smallest, most impossible acts, creating a life to guard another, watching a face in silent awe, were the truest measures of care, and the kindest measures of parenthood he had ever attempted. And somewhere, perhaps in another universe or just another layer of memory, Morty slept safely, echoing in Rick's heart like the softest pulse of a distant star. The morning had a strange rhythm, one that didn't belong to clocks or calendars, but to echoes of a memory that kept stretching itself thin. Rick's garage seemed wider than usual, the ceiling higher, the air lighter yet dense with faint hums of half-forgotten machines. Pancakes once burnt and smeared with syrup existed in some loop of thought, not quite real but almost tangible. Every version of Rick and Morty, who had ever sat at a table, shared a laugh, spilled a drink, or quietly stared at one another across time, appeared in this strange breakfast, some smiling, some exhausted, some absent entirely. The table stretched endlessly, like a reflection of infinite possibilities, each plate a fragment of love and regret. And at the center, hovering in soft blue light, Rick realized something that had always been invisible until now. Every universe carried the same silent pulse. The moment after he said, "I'm proud of you," even if the words had never left his mouth, Morty floated through the scene, unafraid of the duplicates, the echoes, the versions of himself that were younger, older, braver, or quieter. He moved slowly, the floor beneath him humming with memories, each one a tiny vibration in a string of infinite mornings. He reached for a glass of syrup and it shimmered, refusing to pour in the normal way, as though the universe itself had decided that gravity should bend to quiet reflection. He giggled, a small melodic sound, and every version of Rick looked up, some with a flicker of recognition, others with distant amusement. But it wasn't laughter alone that filled the room. It was understanding. The soft glow of the pancakes, the subtle warmth rising from burnt edges, the way syrup clung and dripped like liquid light, all of it was a meditation on the fleeting beauty of ordinary moments. Rick observed from the far end of the table, leaning on a chair that seemed both solid and unreal at once. He watched the way Morty's hands lingered on the edge of a plate, the careful tilt of a glass, the tiny pause before a bite. The sounds, faint clinks, subtle hums, the whisper of a chair being nudged, became a symphony of quiet intimacy. He had never noticed these fragments before, the patience in a half-smile, the depth of a breath before words were spoken, the weight of small victories that left no marks on a timeline, but carved their traces on the heart. For the first time, he allowed himself to linger in this awareness without correcting, without redirecting, without solving. There was no adventure, no interdimensional threat, no calculation that needed immediate attention. There was only presence. There was only the fragile miracle of shared silence and the warm hum of a universe that paused just long enough to notice. Somewhere in the middle of the table, a version of Rick that might have been yesterday or tomorrow leaned forward, catching a glimpse of Morty's expression as he concentrated on a pancake. The eyes, tired, soft, contemplative, met Morty's gaze, and a subtle recognition passed between them. A silent promise that they were both trying, both reaching, both imperfect. And though the words never fully arrived, the sentiment existed in the tremor of the air, the faint sway of hanging lights, the reflection of syrup on a plate that had no end. In this looped breakfast, Rick understood that parenting wasn't about fixing, teaching, or steering, but about bearing witness, being present, allowing someone to be themselves without judgment or interference. Each repetition, each echo of laughter or bite, was a thread of understanding, a delicate weave of attention that held them together in ways the universe could not fully measure. The scene stretched, folded, and replayed itself like a lullaby, gentle and patient. Pancakes appeared, vanished, reformed. Chairs creaked, whispered, and settled back into place. The smell of burnt sugar lingered with a ghostly sweetness. And through it all, Rick felt the weight of infinite possibilities pressing lightly against his chest. Not oppressive, but tender, urging him to see what had always been in front of him. Morty, small, growing, brave in ways that were quiet but real, shaping him as much as he shaped the boy. The loops of breakfast, endless yet intimate, became a meditation on the fragility of time, the beauty of presence, and the soft resonance of love that didn't need acknowledgement to exist. Rick let the loops play on, allowing every fragment to exist fully, allowing himself to feel the subtle ache of pride and the warmth of connection, without the need to define or explain. At the far edge of the infinite table, Rick noticed a version of himself that might have been younger, happier or just more naive, reaching tentatively for Morty's hand. Morty, without hesitation, Let the gesture happen, and it flowed naturally, silently affirming everything that words could not carry. The light in the room softened to an almost imperceptible shimmer, the hum of machines fading to a gentle whisper, and Rick realized that the breakfast had never truly been about pancakes, syrup, or even the table. It had been about recognition, that even in chaos, even in imperfection, even in the quiet of a garage or the loops of countless mornings, there was a thread of constancy, a pulse of gentle care, a trace of love that could be felt even if it was never spoken aloud. The endless table finally dissolved, leaving only Rick and Morty, the hum of the garage settling into a soft cadence that matched the boy's breathing. He looked at Morty, really looked, and for a moment the weight of all the unspoken "I'm proud of yous" felt lighter, almost bearable. Rick didn't speak. Morty didn't need him to. The quiet was enough. It had always been enough. The room glowed faintly with the echo of every repetition, every fragment, every looped gesture of care, and for the first time Rick felt a subtle release. Not triumph, not closure, but a gentle exhale, a lull in the relentless forward march of time, a soft acknowledgement that the act of being there fully, even in silence, was enough to mark the day as something precious. And somewhere, in the quiet folds of memory and light, Morty smiled without needing a reason. And Rick understood. The breakfast had always been happening. And it had always mattered. The lab was quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that wrapped itself around everything like a blanket, pressing softly against the hum of machines that refused to sleep. Morty's small hands lingered on a console, fingers brushing against buttons that hadn't been pressed in years, until they came upon something unexpected. A crayon-drawn star, taped delicately to the edge of a blinking panel. Its lines were uneven, earnest, innocent, a child's attempt to capture the brilliance of something he only vaguely understood. Morty stared at it, and a faint warmth spread through his chest, as though the star itself carried memory like a gentle pulse, waiting for recognition. Rick, at the far end of the garage, leaned against a workbench, half hidden behind a stack of blueprints and unfinished inventions. He didn't comment, didn't react immediately. He only murmured in a voice soft enough to blend with the lab's ambient hum, "I never looked at that, until now." His gaze lingered unfocused at first, as though tracing the crayon lines was tracing something far deeper, an echo of trust, a fragment of hope, a tiny proof that small gestures could be luminous enough to survive the weight of years. The star glowed faintly, not with the harsh light of technology, but with a pulse that felt human, an illumination that seemed to breathe slow and steady, like a heart learning to beat in quiet rhythm. Morty's breath caught as he realized the star was not just a drawing. It was a marker of presence, a subtle insistence that someone had noticed him, even if only in passing. He held it closer, the paper trembling slightly, feeling the faint texture under his fingers, the way the waxy lines shifted in the dim lab light. And then he laughed softly, a sound small enough to float unnoticed above the whirring and humming machines, yet clear enough to ripple across the room. It was a laughter that held fragments of every moment he had felt unseen, moments that had piled gently atop one another, forming an invisible weight that had never quite pressed down, not until now. Rick turned slowly, eyes meeting Morty's, and for the first time something like recognition passed between them. Not words, not explanations, but an acknowledgement that the world, even in its chaos, contained these quiet points of light. The lab itself seemed to respond. Shadows softened at the edges. The blinking lights of Rick's inventions dimmed to a gentle, almost imperceptible glow, and the faint scent of ozone mixed with the smell of old paper. Morty placed the star on the console again, but this time more carefully, as though returning it to its rightful place might reinforce its existence. He looked at Rick, hoping for some hint, some flicker of approval or understanding. Rick did not speak. He only nodded ever so slightly, a subtle gesture heavy with unspoken words. The star's glow seemed to deepen, as if drawing energy from that quiet nod, filling the space between them with something delicate, something that felt like forgiveness, not for mistakes, not for failures, but for the sheer vulnerability of being alive and known. As the moments stretched, the lab transformed in perception. Morty began to notice the small, almost imperceptible details that had always been there but had gone unremarked. A loose wire coiled like a sleeping snake, the faint vibration of a generator that hummed like distant music, the way dust motes floated lazily in the light and shimmered like fragments of stars caught in a gentle orbit. Each element became a meditation, each sound a soft echo, each movement a whisper of the quiet connection that bridged their differences. And in the center of it all, the crayon star pulsed gently, a tiny sun that had survived time, distance, and forgetfulness, a star born not of science, but of the fragile gravity of care and attention. Rick moved closer then, stepping over a tangle of wires and scattered tools, and for a brief instant the space between them was filled with possibility. He reached out, hesitated, then let his hand hover above the star without touching it. That small act, or perhaps deliberate inaction, carried more weight than words ever could. It was the acknowledgement of a gift, the recognition of effort, and the patience to let it exist without interference. Morty understood. He always understood more than Rick realized, and he felt a quiet pride in his chest, warm and sustaining. It was not the pride of achievement, or the satisfaction of solving a puzzle, but the soft, enduring pride that arises when someone sees your light and allows it to shine, even when it is imperfect. For a long while neither spoke. The lab's hum became a lullaby, a rhythm both mechanical and emotional, guiding them through an unspoken understanding. The star's gentle pulse synced with their breathing, and the world outside seemed to fall away. No portals, no chaos, no infinite possibilities pressing down, just this shared moment of recognition, of quiet care, of small acts of creation that carried weight beyond comprehension. Rick's eyes softened, though he did not smile outright. Morty felt it anyway, the unspoken warmth that tethered them together through memory and gesture. It was a subtle, enduring proof that even in imperfection, even in the silence of the world, love had a way of manifesting itself, small, bright, and persistent, like the pulse of a star cradled in one's hands. The afternoon light, muted and gentle, began to filter through the garage windows, casting shadows that stretched and yawned along the walls. The star continued to glow faintly, as if impervious to the passing hours, a reminder that some moments, though small and fragile, resist the erosion of time. Morty carefully lifted it once more, tracing the edges of the crayon lines with his thumb, and smiled softly, a quiet acknowledgement to both the past and the future. Rick's hand lingered near the console, ready to withdraw or intervene, but he stayed still, allowing the boy's light to persist without complication. In that stillness, both understood, and did not need to say aloud, that the smallest acts, the faintest glimmers, could carry entire universes of meaning if only noticed, if only held with care. Time stretched like taffy, slow and unhurried, and the garage seemed to sigh in response, the hums of machinery softening, the shadows curling into themselves. Morty left the star on the console and turned to Rick, whose gaze, steady and quiet, held a trace of approval that mattered more than any words. In that gentle silence, the air itself felt dense with tenderness, carrying with it the weight of innumerable mornings and infinite small recognitions. The crayon star pulsed unwavering, and for a fleeting moment, the universe seemed less vast, less unknowable, and far more human, because love, even in its most subtle, imperfect form, had finally been acknowledged. And as the garage settled into its calm rhythm, Morty laughed softly again, a sound unmeasured by time, a note that lingered in the gentle hum of everything around them. Rick allowed himself the smallest exhale, a quiet surrender to the moment's perfection, understanding that this fragile, glowing star was as close as he could come to holding the universe and holding Morty in his hands all at once. Rick leaned back in the corner of the garage, the soft whir of machines filling the silence like a heartbeat. The crayon star still lingered faintly in Morty's memory, a pulse of warmth that seemed to have opened the door to something else, a place beyond time, beyond the hum of inventions. Rick closed his eyes briefly and let his thoughts drift, not toward calculations or portals, but toward something fragile, almost sacred, the memory garden. It was a place he rarely visited, a private landscape he'd built in the recesses of his mind, where the echoes of days past took root like flowers in well-tended soil. Each bloom held a fragment of Morty's voice, laughter, questions, or moments of quiet wonder, tiny fragments he had never quite understood, but now could hear if he listened carefully. "Morty," sensing the shift in Rick's attention, leaned closer, following his grandfather's gaze as it seemed to reach past walls, past cluttered tools and scattered blueprints, to somewhere not entirely real yet vividly present. Rick guided him through invisible paths, the outlines of the memory garden materializing softly around them. Flowers bloomed with gentle light, each petal imbued with a sound, a moment, a memory. Some petals shivered faintly, as though holding breaths they had forgotten to release, while others glowed steadily, filled with joy so quiet it had taken decades to notice. Morty extended his hand and lightly touched a violet bloom, and a small echo of his younger voice arose, calling for attention in a way that was at once wistful and comforting. Rick knelt beside him, careful not to disturb the fragile glow of the garden. He had watched over these memories for years, cataloguing, protecting, and sometimes hiding them. But now, in the presence of Morty, he allowed them to exist freely, to drift in the light of recognition. Each flower whispered softly as Morty's fingertips brushed against it, a half-remembered word, a laugh, a question asked long ago. Rick listened to them all, noting the small changes, the echoes of fear, the hints of wonder, the fleeting sparks of pride he had never admitted aloud. It struck him how easily time could erase these moments if they were not tended to, and yet here in this quiet inner world, nothing was lost. Every petal carried significance, an entire narrative of subtle guidance and small love. Morty paused at a cluster of golden blossoms, which shimmered faintly and hummed with the gentle cadence of his childhood curiosity. He knelt, brushing each petal, and found that each sound was slightly altered by distance and memory, softening like sunlight through a foggy window. Rick watched the boy carefully, noting how he handled the memories, not recklessly, not with a sense of entitlement, but with the same patience and wonder the flowers themselves seemed to exude. "They're quiet now," Rick murmured almost to himself, "but they were always here, always waiting." Morty looked up at him, eyes wide but calm, and nodded. He did not need to ask what Rick meant. The garden itself was explanation enough. The air in the garage shifted subtly, the boundaries between the physical world and the memory garden blurring. Shadows from scattered tools flickered across the walls, merging with the soft glows of invisible petals. Rick guided Morty through rows of blooms, each representing a different fragment of his growth. Here was a flower shaped by the first time Morty had built something that actually worked, a small device that hummed imperfectly, yet proudly. There a bloom formed from a question he had asked about stars, a fleeting curiosity that had quietly altered the course of Rick's attention more than he would ever admit. Morty's laughter sounded again, and it mingled with the garden's hum, creating a melody that was at once familiar and strange, as if the past and present were breathing in unison. Rick's own flower remained close to him, tucked near a corner where the glow was faintest, memories of a time when he had tried to say the right thing and failed, of quiet regrets he hadn't shared, moments of care hidden beneath layers of distraction. He knelt beside it, touching a petal carefully. The memory pulsed softly beneath his fingers, warm and pliant. Morty watched him, noting the almost imperceptible change in his grandfather's posture, a release of tension, a willingness to linger without urgency. It was a small miracle, the way these intangible moments had taken form, had waited quietly for recognition, and now found life again in shared attention. The memory garden seemed to expand as they moved through it. The flowers stretched toward them, not in neediness but in quiet acknowledgement, bending gently as though bowing to the presence of the one who remembered. Rick walked slowly, absorbing the patterns, listening to the harmonies of repeated echoes, recognizing the vastness of what had been overlooked for so long. Each blossom contained a narrative of care, of patience, of quiet guidance. Invisible acts made visible, whispers of love folded into the fragile architecture of memory. Morty lingered by a cluster of azure blooms, their edges trembling slightly, and the soft sounds of his own voice emerged, questions from nights spent watching stars, moments he had long forgotten. He laughed gently, the sound resonating across the garden, merging with Rick's quiet hum of acknowledgement. Time stretched thin in the memory garden, moving in waves that seemed unrelated to clocks or reality. The garage itself faded from awareness, becoming a backdrop to the luminous flora. Rick's mind wandered to the realization that these were not merely memories. They were legacies of attention, care embedded in silence. Morty's presence amplified their resonance, Rick did not need to speak. The garden did, offering understanding through its very existence. Each bloom was a testament to the quiet labor of noticing, the subtle affirmation that small, gentle acts of care could accumulate into something eternal. As the afternoon light softened outside, spilling muted blues and grays across the garage floor, Rick and Morty moved through the final rows of the memory garden. Each flower they passed pulsed faintly, synchronized with their breathing, echoing the quiet connection that had grown stronger with recognition. Morty knelt and held a cluster of blossoms in his hands, feeling the warmth of 1,000 small moments, the weight of attention and care. Rick remained still, a silent guardian, allowing the boy to experience the garden fully without interference, letting the memories breathe and exist as they were. Eventually, they stepped back, the garden still glowing faintly around them, the petals vibrating with soft echoes of past moments. Morty looked at Rick, and in the pause he understood without words. The garden was not just a collection of memories, it was a bridge, a demonstration that love, though quiet and often unspoken, could shape a world as vividly as any invention. Rick in turn understood that the presence of Morty in the garden, attentive, patient and reverent, was a gift to him, a chance to see the fruits of his silent care realized and appreciated. They lingered together in quiet, the hum of the garage blending seamlessly with the faint whispers of the garden, the light from each flower casting gentle glows on their faces. Neither spoke. It was unnecessary. In that silence, the memory garden thrived, a living testament to the quiet, enduring power of attention, care, and love, small enough to hold in one's hands, yet vast enough to shape a lifetime. The echoes of past voices, the warmth of remembered moments, and the gentle pulse of shared recognition created a sanctuary where both Rick and Morty could simply exist, tethered to each other through the luminous remnants of time. The soft hum of the garage faded into the background as Rick's thoughts shifted, carrying him away from the memory garden and into the quiet orbit of Beth. Not the mother everyone else knew, not merely the daughter, but the echo that existed between them. He remembered her laughter as a child, light and fleeting, and the way it would trail off into something he could never quite catch. There was a subtle gravity to Beth's presence, one that drew at him without insistence, without demand. Rick realized that all his experiments, all his cosmic wanderings, had been attempts to fill a space that only she could inhabit. A silent orbit of affection, curiosity, and unspoken forgiveness. In the garage, Rick reached for a holographic recorder, its light flickering softly, almost timidly. He dusted off its surface and pressed the play button. A faint glow lit the corner of the room, casting long, delicate shadows that stretched like memories themselves. Beth's voice emerged, soft and lilting, recalling a time he had been too preoccupied to notice. Her first steps in a lab filled with half-finished inventions, her small voice asking why the stars seemed to move differently tonight. Rick listened closely, absorbing each inflection, each pause that carried more meaning than words could hold. He didn't speak. He simply let the sound fill the space between them, a bridge spanning years of absence, curiosity, and unspoken understanding. Morty, sensing the shift in Rick's attention, sat nearby, quiet but present. He had come to understand that the garage was more than a workshop. It was a repository of connections, a place where echoes of family and memory lingered like dust motes in sunlight. Morty's eyes followed Rick's movements, noticing the way his grandfather's hands hovered over the recorder, hesitating before brushing against it gently. She always knew when to ask the right question, Rick murmured almost to himself, as if the walls themselves might answer. Morty nodded, silently acknowledging the weight of that quiet admiration. The hologram shifted, projecting Beth as she had been years ago, a child discovering the boundaries of her own curiosity. She moved with a delicate precision, testing, observing, and never fully aware of how much her presence shaped Rick's days. Rick knelt beside the recorder, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to imagine her orbiting not as a shadow of past mistakes, but as a star guiding him quietly, consistently and without demand. The voice in the recorder was fragile, almost like a whisper caught in a beam of light. Yet it resonated with clarity, moments of unguarded honesty, gentle insistence, and quiet understanding. Rick let the memory bloom around him, expanding until the garage seemed to dissolve into the soft light of Beth's orbit. The shadows of tools and machinery blurred into the periphery, leaving only the warmth of recollection and the unspoken dialogue between parent and child. Morty moved closer, sensing that this was a moment not meant for words but for presence. He leaned against the workbench, watching his grandfather absorb the subtle gravity of Beth's voice. Every note carried a weight that Rick had not realized he had been holding all these years. A gentle reminder that connection need not be loud, that love could exist as a quiet, constant force, shaping without demanding. As the minutes stretched into hours in this timeless corner of thought, Rick remembered other instances, small and luminous. Beth leaving a note tucked under a console, her handwriting neat and cautious, expressing curiosity about a star he had overlooked. A shared silence at the dinner table, where words were unnecessary but the presence of care was unmistakable. He understood now that parenting in its truest form had never been about grand gestures or perfect decisions. It had been about orbiting carefully around those he loved, offering attention and patience, and letting them grow into the space he could not fill. Morty whispered softly, almost inaudibly, "She's always been there, hasn't she?" Rick's hand paused above the recorder. He allowed a slow exhale to escape, the kind that carries years of unspoken sentiment. "Yeah," he replied, voice low and reverent. "Always there, in ways I didn't notice until now." The words themselves were sparse, yet they carried the weight of entire lifetimes, the sum of quiet attention, small failures, and the constancy of presence. Rick rose slowly, letting the soft light of the holographic Beth linger around him like a halo. He walked over to a small window, looking out at the stars drifting silently across the sky. Each star seemed to echo the rhythm of Beth's quiet orbit, distant yet unwavering, a constant witness to growth, mistakes, and love that needed no acknowledgement beyond its own existence. Morty joined him, and together they watched the sky, the gentle pause between them filled with understanding rather than explanation. The garage was still, yet vibrantly alive with the resonance of memory, attention, and subtle care. The hum of old machines mingled with the faint resonance of Beth's recorded voice, and Rick felt something shift, a soft acceptance that some connections, though quiet and sometimes overlooked, were never lost. They lingered in orbit, subtle, consistent, and nourishing, a rhythm that did not require words. Morty realized that the lessons of presence and attention were not always taught explicitly. Sometimes they were demonstrated in quiet observation, in patience, in the acknowledgement of the small things that, when added together, created a universe of care. Rick finally turned from the window, the holographic image fading slowly into memory, leaving only the soft afterglow of warmth in its place. He looked at Morty, and for a brief moment the vast expanse of time, memory, and orbiting echoes condensed into a single quiet understanding. They had witnessed not only Beth's orbit, but the subtle gravity of care itself, invisible yet undeniable, shaping the world around them with gentle insistence. In that stillness, Rick and Morty stood together, listening to the echoes, feeling the quiet pulse of love that persisted without fanfare, eternal and softly luminous. The garage lights flickered gently, but the memory of Beth's orbit remained, embedding itself in the rhythm of the space, a luminous reminder that sometimes the most profound guidance comes not through words or actions, but through quiet, consistent presence. Rick exhaled slowly, a release and recognition of the subtle constellations of care that had always surrounded him, and Morty absorbed the lesson silently, knowing that understanding could exist in orbit, in shadow, and in light alike. Rick leaned back in his chair, the soft hum of the garage settling around him like a blanket, and allowed his thoughts to drift outward, beyond the walls, beyond the faint glow of tools and machines. His mind wandered to a microverse he had once created, a tiny, self-contained universe humming quietly, filled with its own invisible rhythms and secret lives. It was asleep now, the civilizations within pausing in gentle slumber, unaware of him, unaware of time, yet alive in their own delicate, consistent way. He watched the faint pulses of light that threaded through the miniature galaxies, each blink a heartbeat, each shadow a sigh, and he realized that to create was, in part, to let go, to bring life into being, and then surrender it to its own rhythm. Morty sat beside him, still learning the subtle art of watching without interfering. "Does it dream?" he asked, voice soft, almost a whisper. Rick didn't answer immediately. Instead, he focused on the tiny worlds before him, the motionless yet deeply alive planets floating in their quiet ballet. Maybe, he said finally, or maybe it's just resting. Sometimes sleep and dream aren't so different. The two of them observed in companionable silence, the faint glow of the microverse reflecting in Morty's eyes like starlight caught in a gentle tide. Rick's memories merged seamlessly with the vision before him. He remembered nights spent tinkering with life forms that could think and breathe, yet he never interfered too much. He had always been drawn to the quiet pulse of existence, the moments where the universe itself seemed to sigh in relief, as if it recognized a touch of understanding, however small. Morty watched his grandfather, noticing the soft exhalations, the pauses that weren't impatience or distraction, but deliberate acknowledgement of something larger than themselves. The garage felt enormous and tiny all at once, a vessel for memory and cosmos alike. The hum of a distant star echoed faintly, mingling with the mechanical rhythms of Rick's lab, creating a lullaby of interwoven worlds. Rick traced patterns in the air with a finger, imagining the trajectories of unseen creatures and the subtle shifts in cosmic weather, each motion deliberate, soft, and reverent. Morty leaned closer, fascinated, feeling as though he could sense the tiny lives themselves, the gentle stirrings of thought and emotion suspended in the void. Rick said nothing, simply letting Morty absorb the quiet lessons of care without words, showing him that sometimes the weightiest acts of parenting, of love, were invisible and delicate, like the slow rotation of a world tucked into its own orbit. A faint wind drifted through the garage, carrying the smell of ozone and faint traces of distant planets, and Rick closed his eyes for a brief moment. In that pause, the microverse seemed to breathe with him. He imagined the civilizations stirring in dreams, unaware that they were being observed, yet benefiting silently from the attention, the care, and the soft rhythms of presence. Morty tilted his head, imagining himself as one of the small observers within the observer, learning that even in vastness, gentle focus could shape perception, nurture growth, and imbue life with the warmth of being noticed. The light of the microverse shifted, creating soft halos that flickered like candle flames in the night. Rick's thoughts returned to the notion of sleep as a mirror for creation, the pause, the exhale, the release. To bring life into being, he realized, was to invite it to dream, to trust it to rest in its own space, and to acknowledge that he could not control or perfect it. Morty's hand brushed against his grandfather's arm, tentative but certain, a small gesture of shared understanding. Rick glanced at him, catching the quiet reflection of empathy, and allowed himself a fleeting smile, rare, soft, and fleeting as a shooting star. Rick remembered other universes he had birthed, some chaotic, some serene, all fragile. Each had its own form of sleep, its own pauses, its own quiet rebellion against time. In their stillness, he found a new kind of peace, the knowledge that influence could be subtle, that presence could matter even when unnoticed, and that love often manifested in the gentle act of watching and allowing. Morty absorbed this in silence, noticing the unspoken lesson that some guardianship existed, not in interference but in careful observation, in the recognition of delicate life quietly unfolding. Hours seemed to fold into one another, stretched thin by the soft gravity of contemplation. Rick reached for a small console, its lights dimmed to the faintest glow, and allowed it to mirror the rhythms of the microverse. He adjusted frequencies, not to control but to harmonize, letting the tiny lives drift in comfort. Morty leaned back, the glow reflected in his wide, observant eyes, feeling the weight and the warmth of guardianship settle softly into his chest. He began to understand that responsibility and care were not always visible or loud. They could exist in the gentle, unassuming shapes of quiet attention. Rick's thoughts moved again, tracing invisible lines between the worlds, the echoes of stars, and the memory of Beth's orbiting presence, soft yet undeniable. Parenting, he realized, shared a strange kinship with creation, a balance of presence, respect, and restraint. Morty, sensing the depth behind Rick's silence, whispered gently, "So, they're safe, even while they sleep." Rick nodded, his voice soft, almost lost in the hum of machines. Safe because sometimes being there is enough. The garage seemed to breathe with them, the microverse glowing faintly like a heartbeat in miniature. Rick let himself linger, allowing the quiet weight of universes at rest to settle into his bones. Morty, leaning back with a soft exhale, felt the rhythms of countless lives fold into the room, a lullaby of creation, care, and subtle guidance. In that moment, Rick understood that the act of observing, of allowing space for growth and rest, was perhaps the truest expression of love he could offer. When the hum finally softened into near silence, Rick and Morty sat together in a quiet stillness, enveloped in the faint glow of tiny worlds sleeping peacefully. There was no need for words, no need for gestures beyond presence. They were witness and guardian, observer and participant, entwined in a quiet ballet of attention and care. Outside, the stars glimmered faintly, echoing the rhythm of the sleeping universes within, a reminder that life, even when small and unseen, was alive, cherished, and luminous. Rick exhaled a long, soft sigh that seemed to fold the infinite expanse of the microverse into the gentle space of the garage. Morty rested his head lightly against the edge of the workbench, absorbing the calm gravity of the moment. Together, they understood that some lessons of life, parenting and love, existed not in grand statements or heroic acts, but in the delicate, unbroken continuity of attention, quiet care, and the patient watchfulness of the universe itself. The garage was quiet in a way that made the air feel thicker, softer, almost as if it were holding its breath. Rick leaned against a workbench, fingers idly brushing over scattered tools, the faint hum of machines blending with the rhythm of his own thoughts. Somewhere in a corner of the lab filled with old inventions and forgotten sketches, a small glass vial caught Morty's attention. He picked it up, turning it gently in his hands. The label, written in Rick's hurried scrawl years ago, read simply, "For later." Morty felt a subtle weight in the object, a gravity that seemed heavier than the glass itself, heavier than time. He twisted the cap carefully, almost afraid to disturb whatever secrets it held. Inside was a small slip of paper, rolled tightly, almost trembling with anticipation. Morty unrolled it slowly, his fingers brushing the faint scent of dust and lab fumes, and read the words inscribed in Rick's familiar, jagged handwriting. "You won't understand this yet, but I hope you'll forgive me for trying too hard." The message floated in the quiet of the garage like morning mist. Morty's heart skipped, then softened, and he felt a ripple of warmth pass through him, delicate and uncertain. It was an apology that had waited years for a moment of recognition, and in that moment, the weight of unspoken words shifted ever so slightly. Rick watched from a distance, his posture relaxed, but his eyes carrying the quiet weight of someone who had already carried a lifetime of regrets. He didn't step forward, didn't speak. He simply allowed Morty the space to discover the truth buried within. Watching his grandson hold the vial, Morty felt the strange intimacy of shared history, of small unnoticed efforts, of love expressed in ways that never demanded acknowledgement. Rick had built machines to protect, universes to distract, inventions to impress, but in the end, this fragile, simple note contained in a bottle held more weight than any portal or cosmic calculation. Morty turned the vial gently, holding it up to the dim glow of the overhead lamp. It refracted the light, casting tiny specks of luminescence across the worn workbench. He imagined the moment Rick had written it, hands trembling with intention, knowing he might never have the courage to speak aloud what he felt. There was something almost sacred in the act, a kind of time capsule of emotion, delicate as the wings of a butterfly resting on glass. Morty felt tears threaten, but they didn't fall. He allowed himself a small, quiet smile, a soft acknowledgement that sometimes love and regret could coexist in the same breath. Fragile and intertwined, Rick shifted slightly, the faint sound of his movement blending with the hum of old machinery. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured softly, more to himself than to Morty. His words seemed to vibrate in the stillness, echoing faintly like a distant star's heartbeat. Morty, feeling the gravity of the moment, placed the vial back on the workbench with deliberate care. It wasn't about letting go, not yet. It was about noticing, about the understanding that some truths don't require immediate resolution. They simply need recognition, a gentle witnessing. The two of them sat in companionable silence, the soft glow of the garage casting elongated shadows across the floor. Morty's gaze drifted to a nearby shelf, where small inventions hummed quietly, some active, some dormant, each carrying a fragment of Rick's complicated attentions. He realized that the vial, delicate and unassuming, was not an anomaly. It was part of a pattern, a series of tiny gestures stitched together across years, moments meant to express care in the quietest of ways. Morty felt a connection, not just to the words in the bottle, but to the subtle, ongoing language of love that had existed all around him, unnoticed until now. Rick's eyes softened as he watched, the faint glow catching the lines of his face in a way that highlighted both wisdom and weariness. He didn't rush Morty. He allowed the boy to sit with the emotions the vial had summoned. Morty could feel the unspoken communication, the recognition that Rick had tried, had faltered, had failed in ways that only a human could, but had also tried in ways that only a grandfather could, ways that were subtle, patient, and enduring. The hum of the garage seemed to swell, as if the space itself had acknowledged the moment. Shadows of past regrets and quiet triumphs mingled in the dim light. Morty held the bottle again, feeling the fragility, the intent, the soft heartbeat of emotion captured in glass. He thought of all the times Rick had been distant, distracted, but now understood that distance had never meant absence. It had meant preparation, safeguarding, and sometimes simply the courage to remain imperfect while still loving. Morty's small hand pressed gently to the vial, feeling the coldness of the glass juxtaposed against the warmth of the sentiment. He imagined all the words that had never been spoken, all the nights Rick had spent tinkering, calculating, protecting, hoping without expecting. The apology in the bottle was both an offering and a revelation, a way for Rick to reach across time and space without speaking aloud. Morty let the realization settle quietly, like starlight filtering through the leaves of a distant tree. The garage seemed to breathe along with them, the gentle hum of life both within and outside of the microcosms Rick had created. Morty placed the vial back carefully, understanding that some messages were meant to linger, to be revisited, to echo softly in the mind long after the moment had passed. Rick remained nearby, patient, silent, the weight of his presence grounding Morty without words. The lesson was subtle. Love, apologies, and forgiveness often existed in pauses, in quiet observation, in gestures that were never grand but always significant. Morty exhaled slowly, a gentle, measured release, feeling the soft gravity of understanding settle in his chest. He looked at Rick, whose gaze remained fixed on the flickering lights of the workbench. For a fleeting moment, the layers of time, regret, and care all aligned, the past, present, and imagined future existing simultaneously, peaceful, undisturbed. Rick's hand twitched slightly near the console, a small humanizing movement, and Morty realized that the most profound connections often took the quietest forms, subtle and persistent as the pulse of a living universe. The hum of the garage faded into a gentle lull, the machines quieting in harmony with their thoughts. Morty held the memory of the bottle in his mind, not as a burden, but as a soft reminder that even the smallest gestures of acknowledgement could carry infinite weight. Rick's presence, steady yet distant, reinforced the quiet truth that love could exist in imperfect, hesitant, and invisible forms, but still reach the heart fully, if one allowed it. The garage seemed suspended in a delicate balance, a shared sanctuary of quiet understanding, patience, and recognition, the kind of space where words were optional and empathy spoke volumes. Rick exhaled softly, the sound blending with the fading hum of machinery, and Morty leaned back on the floor, holding the memory of the apology like a fragile, luminescent star. It was not closure, not reconciliation, not a declaration, simply the acknowledgement that even in imperfection, even in distance and distraction, connection could be found, soft and persistent as the light that filters through dawn. The quiet weight of the moment settled over them both, a gentle hum that lingered long after the vial was set aside, a lullaby of memory, recognition, and the unspoken promise that love endures, even when wrapped in hesitancy or regret. The ship floated silently through the vast darkness of space, stars scattered like spilled sugar across the velvet sky. Rick piloted with a steady hand, the hum of the engines soft, a subtle vibration that seemed to harmonize with the quiet rhythm of the cosmos. Morty sat beside him, knees drawn up, staring through the viewports at the expanse beyond, where a pale silver moon hung suspended. Its surface shimmered strangely, reflecting not only the light of distant suns, but also fragments of memory. echoing experiences that had never been spoken aloud. Rick adjusted the trajectory slowly, guiding them toward the lunar orb, the mirror moon as he had once called it, in half-remembered notes scribbled on scrap paper. This moon was unlike any celestial body they had encountered. Each crater, ridge, and shadow acted as a mirror, showing moments of Rick's life he had tried to bury beneath layers of invention, distraction, and distance. Morty watched as scenes flickered across the moon's reflective surface, the images moving fluidly, like memories flowing in a slow, deliberate current. There were times of quiet laughter with Beth as a child, solitary nights in the garage tinkering with machines, moments when Rick had tried and failed to connect, each one shimmering faintly, yet unmistakably alive. Rick's eyes were fixed on the mirror moon, the reflection of his own choices and attempts to navigate the labyrinth of parenthood stretching across its surface. He remained silent, allowing the silence of the ship and the moon's spectral glow to envelop them. Morty didn't speak either. He simply watched, absorbing the weight of observation, the intimacy of witnessing someone's unspoken regrets and quiet triumphs. The mirror moon was not a place for words. It existed to show truth without interpretation, to lay bare the threads of life that often went unnoticed in the rush of living. The moon's surface pulsed softly, as if breathing, and Rick leaned closer to the viewport. He could see a younger version of himself, unaware, laughing carelessly, building machines without consideration for the impact on those he loved. Each reflection was tender, fragile, and filled with both pride and regret. Morty recognized some of the moments, some only from stories, some purely imagined, yet they carried the weight of lived experience nonetheless. For a while, the two of them were suspended in time, observers of echoes, allowing the moon to illuminate what had been hidden in the quiet corners of the heart. Rick's hands rested lightly on the controls, tension softened by the gentle luminescence of the moon. He thought of all the moments he had overlooked, all the times he had prioritized invention over presence, intellect over empathy. And yet, looking at the mirror moon, he felt the subtle reassurance that acknowledgement, even silent, could still carry meaning. Morty's gaze lingered on the reflections of shared experiences, the subtle gestures of care Rick had made over the years that often went unnoticed, fixing a loose panel for Beth, leaving a small note, humming softly to a sleeping child. These ephemeral acts, like whispers in the dark, formed constellations of love in Morty's mind. The ship drifted closer, and the moon's reflective surface seemed to ripple gently, echoing the soft undulations of memory. Rick allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability, staring at the mirror images without needing to justify, explain, or alter them. Morty, sensing the quiet shift, reached for Rick's hand lightly, not for comfort, but as a tether between past and present, a gentle acknowledgement of the unspoken dialogue flowing between them. In that moment, the moon's reflection felt less like accusation and more like a reminder that even imperfect actions, even hesitant love, still left traces that mattered. Rick's eyes softened as he traced the image of a small, tentative smile from a long-past Morty, a moment when the boy had looked up to him with trust that Rick had rarely earned, but always cherished. The moon's light cast silver halos across the cabin, creating a space where the weight of the universe seemed both immense and tenderly intimate. Morty's chest rose and fell steadily, the rhythm of his breathing syncing with the pulse of the reflected memories. The two of them sat in companionable stillness, the ship carrying them forward, while the mirror moon silently offered reflection and understanding. A soft, cosmic wind seemed to flow through the viewport, brushing against the edges of consciousness. Rick felt the subtle gravity of the reflections, how they pulled at the threads of his life without force, gently revealing the contours of love, failure, and persistence. Morty's gaze lingered on the moon as well, recognizing not only Rick's past attempts, but also the continuity of care that had threaded through his actions, sometimes hidden beneath layers of cynicism, sometimes expressed in fleeting gestures always present. It was a moment of quiet reconciliation, not spoken but deeply felt, a shared acknowledgement that the past could coexist with the present. That silence could carry profound connection. Rick allowed the ship to hover in orbit around the mirror moon, letting the reflections move slowly, deliberately across the surface. Morty's mind wandered through the scenes, imagining all the versions of Rick that had existed, all the choices that had been made, all the lessons learned in the quiet of observation. He saw how the smallest gestures, the acts left unspoken, carried weight across time, how the love beneath imperfection could be recognized if one paused long enough to notice. The moon's light shimmered against their faces, illuminating subtle features, the shadows of emotion etched lightly upon skin and thought. Time in the ship slowed, not artificially, but as if the universe itself were observing, granting them permission to linger. Rick and Morty remained seated, neither speaking, letting the mirror moon's quiet revelations wash over them. Every reflection, every flicker of light became a meditation on care and presence, a gentle recognition that even in failure, even in missteps, love had been threaded through the very fabric of their lives. Morty's hand lingered near Rick's, a silent affirmation that he understood, that he had seen the quiet efforts, that he felt the unspoken attempts to connect. As the ship drifted away, leaving the mirror moon slowly receding into the distance, both Rick and Morty carried the impressions of what they had witnessed. The moon's reflections remained etched in memory, a reminder that acknowledgement could be silent, that love could exist in quiet spaces, that understanding could bloom even without spoken words. Rick exhaled softly, a gentle release that seemed to harmonize with the rhythm of the ship and the silent pulse of the reflected memories. Morty leaned back, content, feeling the subtle warmth of connection that transcended words, a lullaby composed not of sound but of presence, observation, and unspoken empathy. The stars outside glimmered gently as if applauding their quiet understanding. The mirror moon faded into the distance, leaving only the echo of reflection, the soft hum of memory and the comforting sense that even silent gestures carry infinite weight. Rick's hand rested near Morty's, not touching, simply present, a quiet witness to the bond that had endured across mistakes, inventions, and cosmic distance. The hum of the ship became a lullaby, carrying them forward through the night, a gentle rhythm that promised continuity, understanding, and the quiet permanence of love expressed without words. The morning stretched across the garage in soft shades of twilight, pale light spilling through the half-open blinds, painting the tools and machines in muted golds and blues. Rick sat at the workbench, hands resting idly on a half-disassembled device, the hum of old machinery blending with the distant, gentle whirring of a fan. Morty lingered near the doorway, watching his grandfather with the quiet attentiveness of someone who had learned to read the unspoken language of presence. There was no need for words. The air itself seemed to hold an understanding between them, fragile and unhurried. Rick's gaze wandered over the garage, taking in the scattered parts and instruments, reminders of inventions past, experiments abandoned, and calculations that had never been recorded. Each piece whispered a story of effort and intention, a soft echo of what had once driven him, and a quieter echo of what he had left behind in the pursuit of brilliance. Morty stepped closer, the floor creaking gently beneath his shoes, and Rick glanced at him with a fleeting softness that had become rare, precious like sunlight slipping between clouds. It was in that moment, as if time itself had slowed, that Rick realized the shift had already begun. Morty had grown, not just in years but in understanding, in patience, in quiet resilience. The child he had once guided, corrected, and sometimes overlooked had become a steady presence, a compass of subtle intuition. Rick noticed the small ways Morty moved, the care in his gestures, the way his eyes lingered on details without needing acknowledgement. In that observation, Rick recognized that the burden of teaching and guarding had shifted, and he felt something unfamiliar but warm: release. The silence between them was profound, carrying the weight of years, yet moving as lightly as a whispered breeze. Rick set down his tools and leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him. Morty approached the workbench and placed a small folded note atop a pile of schematics. Rick did not immediately open it. He allowed the anticipation to linger, savoring the moment of quiet. The note was simple, written in Morty's careful hand. "You've done enough. You've always been enough." Rick's chest tightened slightly, not with surprise but with recognition. For a long while neither spoke. The world outside the garage hummed gently, leaves brushing against windows, distant engines of the city murmuring in soft syncopation. Rick allowed himself to lean back fully, exhaling in a way that seemed to release not just air, but the accumulated tension of countless unspoken conversations. Morty leaned against a nearby bench, observing the older man with patience and understanding that had been cultivated over years of shared journeys, both perilous and mundane. Rick thought of all the moments that had led here, the failed inventions, the quiet evenings when he had tried to explain without words, the times he had left Morty to navigate experiences on his own. Each memory was a star in a constellation, and now, for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to see the pattern not as mistakes, but as attempt, imperfect, often clumsy, yet inherently meaningful. He realized that letting go did not mean absence or neglect. It meant trusting that love, once given, could exist independently, that Morty had grown strong enough to carry the bond forward without constant guidance. The air in the garage seemed to shift, light settling in a new way across the scattered instruments. Rick's eyes softened as he watched Morty's face, serene, calm, present. He imagined all the versions of Morty he had tried to protect over countless adventures, and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel that he had done enough. Enough to teach, enough to guide, enough to love without needing recognition. The acknowledgement did not need to be voiced. It existed in the steady heartbeat of shared existence, in the silent affirmation of presence and care. Morty spoke at last, his voice low and steady. "You don't have to fix everything anymore, Rick. Sometimes just being here is enough." Rick allowed a faint smile to curve his lips, the first in hours, the first in days that felt unforced. He nodded, a simple gesture heavy with understanding, and turned his gaze back to the workbench. He picked up a small, unassuming piece of metal, turning it over in his hands. It was a fragment of an invention long abandoned, yet in that act, he felt a quiet satisfaction, not from success, but from the acceptance of imperfection, from the acknowledgement that presence could carry weight as strongly as genius. The room remained quiet, the soft rhythm of breaths and mechanical hums filling the space. Morty moved closer and placed a hand lightly on Rick's shoulder, a gesture of connection, trust, and acknowledgement. Rick did not move it. He did not need to. The touch was enough, a quiet affirmation of the bond that had evolved beyond the need for constant words, beyond the necessity of instruction or intervention. It was a moment suspended in gentle stillness, as though the world itself had paused to witness the quiet reconciliation of effort, love, and release. Outside, the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, brushing the edges of the garage with a faint golden hue. Rick and Morty remained within the softened glow, cocooned in the gentle hum of the space they had created together. It was a day of letting go, not in sadness but in the fullness of acknowledgement, a recognition that love could persist without control, that care could endure without constant attention. Morty's presence, steady and unwavering, allowed Rick to feel the rare, profound peace that comes from seeing one's guidance reflected back in maturity and understanding. Rick leaned back further, closing his eyes briefly, feeling the warmth of the early light, the subtle vibrations of the garage, the reassuring steadiness of Morty's hand. It was enough, more than enough. And in that realization, a deep, lasting calm settled into the spaces between them. The world beyond the garage could wait. Here, in this quiet, shared moment, existence was enough. Love, acknowledgement, and trust intertwined, a soft, enduring lullaby that required no sound beyond the rhythm of their coexistence. Time seemed to stretch and soften, and for the first time in what felt like decades, Rick allowed himself to simply exist alongside Morty, without obligation, without expectation, without the constant drive to fix or alter. The garage hummed softly, a quiet witness to the day he let go, to the gentle evolution of connection, and to the recognition that sometimes the greatest act of care is release itself. Morty sat back slightly, eyes closing as if in meditation, and Rick felt the profound comfort of understanding that their bond could exist without constant effort, a love unspoken but deeply felt, enduring through stillness, through quiet acknowledgement, and through shared presence. The garage was unusually still that morning. The usual hum of machinery softened to a barely perceptible murmur. Sunlight sifted through the dusty blinds, painting long stripes across the scattered tools, the workbench and the shelves lined with half-finished inventions. Rick sat on a worn stool, leaning over an old device whose metal casing was scratched and dulled from years of neglect. Morty lingered nearby, arms crossed loosely, watching the older man with quiet curiosity. The invention, a small box of blinking lights and whirring cogs, seemed almost alive, as if it had been waiting for this very moment to awaken again. Rick's fingers traced the edges of the machine, feeling the subtle vibrations of its internal mechanisms. It had been a project he had started long ago, one meant to replicate moments he could never fully grasp, to capture the fleeting instants of connection, joy or discovery, and replay them with the same resonance they had held the first time. He had abandoned it, frustrated by the impossibility of perfection, yet now, as Morty's presence filled the space with quiet steadiness, the device hummed to life as if recognizing the gentle inevitability of the present moment. Morty stepped closer, peering over Rick's shoulder. "What does it do?" he asked softly, not wanting to disturb the fragile rhythm of awakening. Rick didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pressed a small button, and the garage filled with the faint sound of laughter. Morty's laughter from years ago, high-pitched, full of wonder, and slightly uncertain. It floated in the air like wind chimes, soft and melodic, weaving around the scattered instruments and shelves. Rick watched Morty's face as he recognized the echoes of his own past self, the younger boy who had run through corridors of adventures without knowing how fleeting time could be. The memory played on, shifting slightly like water in a stream, revealing moments Morty had never consciously recalled. The day he had fixed a broken radio with trembling hands, while Rick pretended to be distracted, the quiet evening when he had sat by a window watching stars, imagining endless worlds beyond his reach, the small victories and simple joys that had quietly shaped him. Rick listened alongside him, allowing the sounds to wash over him without interruption, without analysis. There was no need to fix, explain, or alter. The moment was whole in its imperfection. Rick set the device down and leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him. He let the sound of Morty's laughter linger in the room, letting it fill the empty spaces where words had often failed. Morty sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed, swaying gently to the rhythm of remembered joy. It was a rare piece, one that existed without the urgency of adventure, without the weight of invention, without the constant drive to control outcomes. In this moment, time itself seemed to yield, stretching softly around them, allowing for full immersion in memory and presence. Rick thought of all the things he had tried to protect Morty from, dangers that seemed immense in the moment, but trivial in the light of reflection. The device, though imperfect, captured something more enduring, the quiet resilience of a child who had learned to find joy even when guidance was inconsistent, the subtle artistry of recognition and care. He realized that even the smallest act of witnessing, simply being present while another person grew and discovered themselves, could carry a weight equal to any invention or portal he had ever created. Outside, the sun climbed higher, brushing the tops of trees and the edges of nearby rooftops with gentle gold. The sound of the memory faded slowly, replaced by the ambient quiet of the garage. Morty opened his eyes, blinking against the light, and smiled softly at Rick. "It's like being there again," he said, voice almost a whisper. Rick nodded, allowing a rare warmth to settle in his chest. He did not speak. Words were unnecessary. Presence, acknowledgement, and shared stillness conveyed everything that needed to be felt. Rick picked up the device again, turning it over in his hands. He could have dismantled it, repurposed it, or tried to perfect it endlessly as he often did with his creations. But he resisted. Instead, he left it as it was, a repository of memory and care, imperfect yet complete in its function. Sometimes, he realized, the greatest invention is not one that changes the world, but one that preserves the subtle, ephemeral moments that define it. Morty leaned back, tracing his fingers along the floor, watching the faint glimmer of light reflecting from the device. "Do you ever think about all the stuff you didn't finish?" he asked. Rick considered this, letting the question linger like a note held in the air. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice low and reflective, "but maybe some things are better left. For the right time." He glanced at Morty, eyes softening. "Some memories aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to be felt." The room settled into quiet again, the soft hum of the device fading into the background, harmonizing with the distant sounds of a waking world. Rick watched Morty, noting how much he had grown, how resilient he had become, how capable of joy even in the absence of perfection. The act of witnessing this growth, of sharing a silent understanding, felt more profound than any invention, more satisfying than any scientific breakthrough. It was a gentle acknowledgement that some things, love, care, memory, could endure without intervention, without explanation, without control. For a long while, they remained together in that gentle silence, Rick seated on the stool, Morty nearby, the forgotten invention humming faintly like a heartbeat. It was not a moment of grandeur, not one marked by adventure or revelation, but it was enough. The sound of past joy lingered in the room, creating a cocoon of warmth and reflection that neither needed to punctuate with words. Rick allowed himself to simply exist in the presence of what he had built, not for the sake of science, but for the quiet affirmation of connection, care, and understanding. As the light shifted and shadows lengthened, Rick finally leaned back fully, closing his eyes briefly, feeling the gentle pulse of life around him. Morty, sensing the rhythm, rested his head against a nearby workbench, exhaling slowly. The garage was still yet filled with subtle life, the life of remembered laughter, shared presence, and the quiet acknowledgement that some things endure, unseen but deeply felt. Rick realized that the act of letting memory live, even imperfectly, was itself an act of care. He would not need to say it aloud. The room, the device, and Morty's serene expression carried the sentiment fully. Outside, the day moved quietly on, but within the garage, time existed in gentle loops of recollection and presence. Rick and Morty, surrounded by the soft hum of old machines and the echo of past joy, allowed themselves to simply be, unhurried, unobserved, and profoundly connected. The forgotten invention rested on the bench, no longer a relic of abandonment, but a vessel of tender continuity, proof that even in incompleteness there is meaning, and that the simplest gestures can hold the deepest resonance. Rick awoke in the quiet of his lab, the soft hum of dormant machines brushing against the edges of consciousness. The morning light filtered through the blinds in thin golden slats, cutting across the scattered gadgets, floating tools and tangled cords as if drawing paths through a map of old regrets. Today, like so many others, he carried with him the weight of unfinished inventions, unspoken words, and the countless moments where intentions had collided with inability. Morty sat nearby, curled up on the floor with a small notebook, doodling lightly, seemingly unaware of the gravitational pull of memories pressing around them. Rick drifted through the lab, moving slowly, deliberately, as if each step might disturb fragile echoes of the past. He passed the shelves lined with half-finished devices, each one a testament to his relentless pursuit of perfection and control, and each one also a reminder of what had been lost, opportunities to be present, moments when connection had faltered. Some of the machines hummed faintly, almost as if they remembered him, vibrating in sympathetic resonance with his own subdued heartbeat. Rick's gaze lingered on a small floating room at the corner of the lab, a chamber of mirrors he had constructed long ago, where gravity could be suspended and the physical laws of his world could bend at will. Morty, sensing his grandfather's introspection, quietly lifted his head. "What's that room for?" he asked softly, voice threaded with curiosity rather than impatience. Rick didn't answer immediately. He walked over, placing a hand on the cool metal door, feeling the subtle vibrations echoing through the walls. He stepped inside and the room responded. The floor loosened its pull, chairs and tables hovering in slow arcs. Papers and blueprints swirled gently around him, floating as if suspended in thought, caught between intention and failure. Rick allowed himself to drift, arms outstretched, letting the familiar sensation of weightlessness carry him, and with it, the memories he had long avoided. Inside the floating room, past versions of himself drifted alongside him, some young, feverish with discovery, some older, weary, their eyes heavy with the weight of regret. Rick watched silently as they collided and separated, half-finished inventions in hand, scribbled notes in motion, expressions frozen between hope and despair. The scene was hypnotic, a delicate choreography of memory, achievement, and failure. The older Rick noted how gravity seemed to mirror the human condition, relentless, unavoidable, and yet sometimes forgiving when approached with gentleness. The echoes of his past mistakes hung in the air like soft mist, tangible yet untouchable, reminders that regret had weight, even if it could be borne lightly. Morty entered the room slowly, floating beside him with careful movements, eyes wide but calm. "Grandpa, are these all you?" he whispered, gesturing to the specters of past selves and the suspended inventions around them. Rick's gaze softened. "Some of them," he murmured. "Some are what I wanted to be, some are what I feared. They all matter, Morty, even if only to remind me I tried. Even if I failed, they remind me I cared." The words were rare, unpolished, but they carried a weight greater than any machine he had ever built. Morty reached out, letting his fingers graze a floating notebook. It twirled slowly, suspended mid-air, and he understood that the lesson wasn't in perfection, but in acknowledgement. They drifted together through the room, past floating clocks frozen in fragmented time, gears suspended mid-turn, and half-written messages looping silently in the air. Each object was a fragment of a choice, a moment Rick had acted, hesitated, or withdrawn. Morty watched, absorbing the delicate interplay of past and present, realizing that these were not merely mistakes or failures, but expressions of intent, of care unspoken and imperfectly executed. He saw the weight of each decision pressing against the walls of the room, pulling gently, bending reality itself around them, yet never breaking the tenuous connection between grandfather and grandson. Rick stopped near a cluster of floating tools, a wrench, a soldering iron, a sketch of an invention never completed. He reached out, letting them drift back toward the shelf with care. "Even gravity," he said softly, "gets tired of holding us down sometimes. But you learn to float anyway. You find the moments that keep you aloft, even if the rest of it presses down hard." Morty nodded, his gaze focused on the floating light above, the edges of the room shimmering with quiet resonance. For a moment, silence enveloped them both, but it was not emptiness. It was reflection, acknowledgement, and shared presence. The room slowly returned to its usual state as gravity resumed its hold. Chairs settled, papers landed gently on workbenches, and clocks ticked once more. Rick and Morty stood together, the weight of the room lingering in their awareness. The older Rick realized that the true gravity had never been of machines or universes, but of choices, of care, and of the persistent pull of memory. Morty, standing beside him, seemed to understand this instinctively, a soft empathy born of observation and shared experience. As they left the floating room, the rest of the lab felt warmer, gentler, imbued with the quiet knowledge that mistakes and successes, joys and regrets, all contributed to the delicate balance of life. The hum of dormant machines no longer felt oppressive. It felt like a lullaby of persistence and acknowledgement. Rick glanced at Morty, allowing himself a rare smile, the kind that carried a subtle understanding that some acts of love, even those fraught with error, could sustain across time and memory. Outside, sunlight touched the edges of the garage, soft and forgiving. Rick and Morty moved together, quiet and unhurried, each step a testament to survival, understanding, and the subtle gravity of care. The day pressed on, but the weight of regrets, once looming, now felt lighter, tempered by the act of shared recognition and the presence of someone who understood the unspoken language of memory and intention. They paused at the doorway, looking out at the morning sky, and Rick said almost to himself, "Gravity is patient. Morty, so are we." Morty nodded, feeling the truth in the statement as they stepped back into the gentle rhythm of their lives, carrying the weight of regret lightly, cushioned by reflection and shared presence. Rick and Morty drifted through the starlit void in the old, familiar spacecraft, the hum of the engines a soft lullaby against the endless black. Beyond the viewport stretched a planet unlike any they had visited before, a muted orb, cloaked in soft violet clouds that drifted lazily across its sky, moving not by wind, but by some invisible rhythm of stillness. Time here did not march forward or backward. It simply lingered, folding upon itself like the pages of a book left open for too long. Rick felt it immediately, a curious sensation, as though every second he breathed held an eternity within it. Morty leaned against the side of the cockpit, eyes wide behind the dim reflection of the instruments. "Grandpa, it feels slow," he murmured. His voice was small, almost swallowed by the quiet hum of the ship and the distant pulse of the planet below. Rick nodded, fingers resting lightly on the console. "Slow isn't the word, Morty. Here nothing forces itself on you. You exist alongside it. You meet it halfway. The words were soft, reflective, more to steady himself than to instruct. When they touched down, the landing was silent, almost reluctant, as if the planet itself were conscious of their intrusion. The ground was smooth, its surface rippling gently under their feet like the faint echo of water, stirred from a great distance. Rick took a cautious step and felt the subtle drag of time around him, a weightless resistance that made the act of walking feel like drifting through clouds. Morty followed, hand brushing against the soft, iridescent grass that bent to no wind, whispering faintly as they passed. Rick gestured to a small hillock rising ahead. "Sit," he said simply. The two settled side by side, legs dangling over the gentle slope, gazing upward. The sky above was a canvas of suspended moments. Stars hung in motionless arcs, their light steady yet alive as though caught mid-breath. Rick realized that even without clocks, without instruments, without the relentless push of seconds and minutes, he could feel every heartbeat, every breath, every memory pressed into the same quiet frame. Morty tilted his head, studying the stillness with a mixture of awe and childlike curiosity. "It's peaceful," he whispered, a small shiver of wonder in his voice. Rick didn't answer immediately. He simply watched Morty's eyes trace the frozen constellations. The delicate shimmer of time paused in mid-motion. Then slowly Rick spoke, voice low and even. "Peaceful isn't something you find, Morty. It's something you recognize when you stop trying to hold on to the rest of it. It's the silence between the beats, the spaces we forget to notice when we rush." A long pause settled between them, filled with the soft echoes of the planet's own muted rhythm. Rick reached out, letting his fingers brush Morty's hand, not touching for comfort, but acknowledging the quiet bond that had grown between them, a subtle understanding of presence that needed no words. Morty turned slightly, leaning against his grandfather, and Rick allowed the contact to linger. For once the weight of responsibility, of fear, of regret, did not press down upon him. Here in the planet without time, even his mistakes could float freely, suspended alongside the moments he cherished. Rick's gaze drifted over the horizon, watching a river of starlight curl lazily along the ground, frozen in place yet impossibly fluid. Each ripple was like a memory caught between what had been and what could have been, a spectrum of possibility rendered harmless by stillness. He imagined all the times he had rushed, all the moments he had overlooked while chasing urgency, and he felt a subtle, unspoken forgiveness for himself. Morty, sensing the shift in Rick's energy, tilted his head and smiled softly. "It's like everything can just be okay here." Rick didn't reply, only nodded, the faintest curve of his lips betraying agreement. They spoke very little after that, letting the language of the planet, its suspended motion, its soft luminescence, its gentle hum, fill the spaces between them. Rick felt a rare lightness in his chest, a momentary shedding of the constant tension that had long defined him. Morty in turn felt the same ease, the quiet understanding that sometimes being together, present and unhurried, was more meaningful than any adventure or invention. They sat in the silence, their forms silhouetted against the surreal landscape, breathing in the languid rhythm of a world where time had chosen to rest. Eventually, Rick reached into his pocket and retrieved a small notebook, its pages blank but waiting. He flipped it open and sketched, not for experiments or equations, but simple lines, circles and arcs, shapes that mirrored the curves of the frozen river and the gentle sway of the iridescent grass. Morty watched, intrigued, then grabbed a small stick from the ground and began sketching alongside him. The two drew side by side, the act of creation quiet and unhurried, a shared meditation of hands and thoughts. Even mistakes became part of the art, incorporated seamlessly, like the natural rhythm of the planet itself. As the light, both star and ambient glow, bathed them, Rick reflected on what he had learned across countless worlds and endless timelines, that parenthood, care and love were not measured by precision or perfection, but by presence. Even if he had failed in other universes, in other moments, he could find a kind of redemption here, in recognition of the small, quiet choices to simply exist alongside someone. Morty, sensing the depth behind the gesture, pressed his hand gently against Rick's arm, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had grown and softened with time. They lingered long into the planet's eternal moment, watching the skies and touching the muted earth beneath them. The world offered no lessons, no urgency, only the gentle reminder that sometimes to truly care, one must simply be attentive, patient, and present. Rick understood this as fully as he ever had, a rare and quiet clarity that settled over him like a soft blanket, warm and forgiving. Morty leaned against his side, eyes closing in contentment, and Rick, for the first time in countless cycles of chaos, allowed himself to feel what it meant to be enough. And when they finally rose to leave, the planet did not protest or change. It remained unhurried and silent, a testament to the power of stillness. Rick piloted the ship back into the vast, timeless void, Morty beside him, carrying the quiet weight of lessons learned, of peace earned, of forgiveness accepted, both of the world and of oneself. Rick leaned back in the cockpit chair, staring at the stars drifting past like slow rivers of light. The silence of space stretched outward, carrying with it a weight that was neither oppressive nor frightening, but intimate, as though the universe itself was settling in to listen. Morty sat beside him, head resting lightly against the armrest, eyes half closed in that soft, drowsy gaze that spoke of trust and ease. In this quiet, Rick felt every version of himself beginning to fade. The versions that had rushed, that had fought, that had tried too hard to fix the unfixable. It was as though each fragment of his chaotic life was dissolving into the ether, leaving only the essential shapes, the moments of care, the small acts of presence, the quiet love he had learned to recognize too late. The ship hummed softly beneath them, a gentle accompaniment to their thoughts. Rick's fingers traced the edge of the console absent-mindedly, feeling the cool metal like a tether to reality. His mind wandered through countless timelines, half-formed inventions and long-forgotten regrets. Each one felt less like a failure and more like a constellation, scattered points of light in a vast darkness. And in this collapse, he noticed something new, the quiet satisfaction of simply having tried, of having existed alongside Morty, of having offered the small remnants of guidance that mattered. Morty stirred slightly, shifting to look at Rick. "Grandpa, are you okay?" His voice was gentle, almost hesitant, as though speaking might disrupt the fragile stillness that had settled between them. Rick smiled softly, a small curve that didn't reach his eyes but conveyed understanding. "I'm learning to be," he replied. His voice was lower than usual, thoughtful, almost like a whisper that only the empty ship could hear. "Sometimes, Morty, being isn't about fixing everything. It's about being here, right now, with whoever needs you." The thought felt strange to Rick, who had spent so much of his life running, inventing, and manipulating time itself. Yet in this soft collapse he found clarity. Parent and child, student and teacher, wanderer and witness, the roles they had played over the years began to blur. Morty's presence was no longer a responsibility to manage, but a companion in stillness. Their shared silence became a language unto itself, punctuated only by the occasional hum of machinery and the faint echo of stars far beyond. Rick's gaze drifted to the console, where a flickering readout of interdimensional coordinates pulsed softly. He considered their journey, the countless worlds they had touched, the beings they had saved or overlooked, the mistakes that had stacked like so many dusty tomes in the corner of his mind. And yet, in all of that, he realized the most profound act of creation had not been the machines, the portals, or the clever manipulations of space-time. It had been the slow, quiet cultivation of presence, the willingness to stay, to witness, to guide without demanding perfection. Morty reached over, picking up a small, smooth rock that had drifted into the cockpit during a planetary visit long ago. He turned it in his hands, feeling its edges, its weight, its silent story. "You know, Grandpa, I think I get it now. You've been trying in your own way, even if it didn't always make sense." Rick nodded, taking the rock gently and rolling it between his fingers. "Trying isn't enough sometimes, Morty," he admitted. "But sometimes it's all you can do. And if you're here, if you notice, that's where it matters." Outside, the stars continued their slow drift, each one a soft punctuation in the cosmic silence. Rick felt his chest expand with a strange calm, a mixture of relief, understanding, and tentative hope. The versions of himself that had been harsh, distant, or impatient seemed to dissolve quietly, leaving behind a clarity that was almost uncomfortable in its simplicity. Here in the weightless void, He had no one to impress, no timeline to manipulate, no crises to avert. Only the shared presence of Morty, the steady hum of the ship, and the unfolding quiet of the universe itself. Rick's thoughts wandered to the countless lessons he had neglected to teach, or perhaps lessons he had taught in ways too sharp, too hurried. He realized that many of them had been absorbed by Morty anyway, silently in his own time. Each small gesture of care, each brief smile, each act of patience had left a trace. It was a slow accumulation, almost imperceptible yet enduring. The soft collapse of Rick's old rigidity allowed him to see it all at once. The constellation of tiny, meaningful moments that had always mattered more than grand gestures or heroic feats. Morty shifted again, leaning closer. "Grandpa, do you think we can stay like this for a while?" His voice was sleepy but earnest. Rick glanced at him, the corners of his eyes softening. "We can, Morty, as long as we want." And in that instant, Rick allowed himself to release the pressure of all the universes he had carried, the relentless need to fix, to control, to understand everything. Here in this quiet corner of existence, he could simply exist, and that, he realized, was enough. The ship drifted onward, unhurried, as the stars and planets passed by in slow-motion grace. Rick let the soft collapse envelop him, feeling each heartbeat, each breath, each unspoken word settle into the vast quiet of space. Morty's small hand rested lightly against his arm, a tether to something real, tangible, and enduring. In the gentle folding of time and presence, Rick felt the universe exhale alongside him, a shared surrender to the moment, fragile but complete. And as they floated through the endless night, Rick allowed the realization to sink fully. That love, presence, and patience were the truest acts of courage, the quietest forms of heroism. In letting the collapse happen, he discovered a serenity that no invention, no portal, no manipulation of time could ever grant. He understood finally that the soft collapse was not the end, but a gentle transformation, a quiet birth of something deeper, slower, and infinitely more enduring. Rick exhaled, letting the weight of old versions, old regrets, and old selves fall away. Morty's eyes drifted closed, his small body warm and trusting beside him. And in that long, soft moment, Rick recognized that even the collapse could hold beauty, could hold love, and could hold the promise of rest. The morning light drifted lazily into the garage, though morning was more a suggestion than a certainty in Rick's endless hours. Dust motes floated through the beams, illuminated like tiny stars suspended in space. Rick sat at the workbench, though not with tools or vials today. Instead, he watched Morty carefully, almost reverently, as the boy dabbed paint across a small canvas. Each stroke was deliberate yet loose, a mixture of hesitance and curiosity, as though he were discovering the shapes of the world for the first time. Rick did not interfere. He simply observed, letting the silence become a canvas of its own. Morty hummed softly, a tune that Rick didn't recognize but found comforting. The colors on the paper blended into gentle swirls, blues that felt like dusk, yellows that carried the faint warmth of remembered sun, and reds so soft they reminded Rick of a fading blush on someone he once knew. The painting was neither perfect nor structured, and yet it held something more profound than any invention, a quiet honesty. Rick felt a pang in his chest, the kind of feeling that was tender, sharp, and warm all at once. It was the realization that some things did not need to be fixed, explained, or enhanced. They simply existed in their own truth, and that was enough. For the first time in a long while, Rick allowed himself to forget the urgency of timelines, the weight of universes, and the pressure of knowledge. He could just be present, fully, completely unhurried. He noticed how Morty's tongue peeked slightly from his lips when he concentrated, how his small hands trembled with excitement, and how the soft hum of the garage seemed to synchronize with the rhythm of the brushstrokes. Rick remembered a time long ago when he had thought that understanding someone meant controlling the variables around them. Now he realized that presence alone, the simple act of noticing, without interference, could be the most powerful gift of all. The canvas began to bloom with life, each color resonating like a quiet memory that had waited years to be remembered. Rick's gaze wandered from the painting to the small trinkets scattered on the workbench. A broken portal gun, a tarnished screwdriver, a few scraps of starlight he had collected in jars. All of them seemed to hum with quiet significance, as though they had been waiting for a moment like this to finally be acknowledged. Rick realized with gentle awe that life had never been about grand achievements or cosmic victories. It had been a series of fleeting gestures, subtle touches, and small acts of care, unnoticed by many but deeply meaningful to those who mattered. Morty stepped back from the canvas, eyes wide with a combination of pride and uncertainty. "Grandpa, what do you think?" he asked softly, almost afraid to disturb the fragile balance of the room. Rick smiled, a slow, deliberate curve that carried both affection and a quiet approval. "It's perfect," he said. And in that single word, Morty felt a warmth that no applause or critique could ever have matched. Rick didn't need to fix the colors, the shapes, or the uneven edges. They were beautiful because they were his, because they carried intention, curiosity, and a trace of innocence. The garage seemed to breathe with them, expanding and contracting like a living entity. Rick noticed how the light played across Morty's face, highlighting the subtle changes in expression, the flicker of thought behind his eyes, and the quiet joy of creation. He remembered times when he had overlooked such moments, distracted by crises, inventions, or the lure of the infinite. But now, watching Morty, he understood that these small, soft memories were the essence of existence, fragile, luminous, and infinitely important. Rick reached over and touched the edge of the canvas, feeling the texture of the paint beneath his fingers. The sensation was grounding, simple, and profound. He thought of all the things he had tried to teach Morty, all the lessons that had been drowned out by urgency and chaos. Perhaps none of them mattered as much as he had believed. What mattered now was this: presence, patience, and the gentle acknowledgement of beauty in small, fleeting moments. Outside, the sky shifted imperceptibly, blending from soft morning blues to the pale gold of a sun that had no rush to rise. The garage was quiet but not empty. Every hum, every creak of metal, every faint whisper of air carried a resonance of memory and connection. Rick realized that the act of watching, of being silently present, was itself a form of love, subtle, unobtrusive, but undeniably potent. Morty, absorbed in his creation, did not need validation beyond the quiet presence of the person who mattered most. And Rick, for once, allowed himself to exist fully in that simple truth, without calculation, without expectation. Time seemed to stretch, elongating each second into a soft, enduring moment. Rick observed the interplay of shadow and light across the painting, across Morty's face, across the room that had once been a chaotic lab and was now a sanctuary of quiet creation. The realization settled gently over him. Sometimes, doing nothing at all, simply existing alongside someone, quietly witnessing their expression of self, was the truest act of care. As Morty dipped the brush into another color, Rick felt a rare peace descend over him. The constant churn of thought, the obsession with invention and consequence melted into the background. In its place was a simple rhythm: presence, observation, acknowledgement. The colors on the canvas swirled like memories of all they had shared, both joyful and painful, blending into something new, something alive and warm, and entirely theirs. Rick exhaled slowly, letting the tension of countless years, failures, and ambitions drift away. Morty's soft humming filled the room, harmonizing with the faint hum of the garage, the gentle pulse of the stars outside, and the quiet rhythm of their breathing. And for the first time in a long time, Rick felt unneeded, unnecessary, and yet completely at peace. In this shared, unspoken understanding, Rick realized that love did not always require words, that patience could be its own language, and that presence could be more meaningful than any invention or cosmic insight. Morty's small hands worked tirelessly on the canvas, and Rick simply watched, letting each stroke wash over him like a soft, cleansing tide. The light in the garage shifted, warm and gentle, bathing the canvas, the boy, and the father figure in a luminous embrace. The world outside could wait. The universes, the crises, the responsibilities, they could all wait. For now, the colors of memory, the quiet act of creation, and the gentle rhythm of life were all that mattered. And in that slow, deliberate peace, Rick allowed himself to stay, fully present, fully silent, fully alive. The night stretched wide over the garage, deep and velvety, the kind of darkness that seemed to pulse softly with memory. Rick sat back in his worn chair, fingers tracing idle patterns on the armrest, eyes fixed on a wall of humming equipment. Every light blinked like a distant star, quiet and insistent, and the air carried the faint tang of metal, ozone, and long-forgotten experiments. Morty lay on a cot nearby, breathing slow and even, asleep with a softness Rick rarely allowed himself to notice. Outside, the wind whispered through the cracks of the garage door, weaving around the humming machines like a lullaby no one had consciously composed. Rick's hand hovered over a small interdimensional receiver, a device he had built years ago but rarely touched. Tonight, curiosity won over caution. He flipped a switch, and the world filled with static, a gentle hiss of unformed sound like rain on a distant roof or the ocean against a cliff unseen. The static vibrated softly in his chest, pulling him deeper into a quiet reverie. Then faintly, almost impossibly, a voice emerged from the white noise, young, proud, and unaware of consequence. It was him, younger Rick, speaking from a time before the burdens of parenting, universes, and regret had settled like dust over his mind. The voice hummed with confidence, excitement, and that peculiar brilliance that had once seemed infinite. Rick leaned closer, the static swirling around him like mist. Each word was half-formed, distorted, a memory suspended in electromagnetic fog. "I can do everything," the voice said, "and no one will know it was ever my choice." There was pride there, but also a hint of innocence, a lack of comprehension of the quiet cost that came with creation. Rick listened in silence, letting the static fill the room like rainfall over dry earth. He felt the years between them stretch taut and then relax, as though the younger version of himself and the present were orbiting the same sun, never quite colliding, but still influencing each other in subtle, undeniable ways. Morty stirred in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. Rick glanced at him, eyes softening. The boy's small chest rose and fell steadily, a rhythm that was grounding and real. It reminded Rick that for all his interdimensional excursions and cosmic insights, the tangible present moments carried weight, weight that the static and the voice from long ago could never replicate. He allowed the young Rick's words to wash over him, each syllable a reflection of ambition, brilliance, and ignorance. He felt a strange mix of melancholy and awe, the realization that time had passed, that he had changed, and yet in this moment, all the layers of himself, past, present, and possible, converged into a quiet understanding. The receiver crackled, the voice faltering slightly, "We can make anything, fix anything." The words seemed to hang half-formed, fragile as frost on a window pane. Rick exhaled slowly, the sound mingling with the hum of machinery and the faint breathing of his grandson. He thought of all the things he had tried to fix over the years, broken machines, broken planets, broken timelines, and of all the things he had neglected, moments with Morty, silences shared, laughter unobserved, and love unspoken. For the first time, the young Rick's pride didn't feel like a reprimand or a challenge. It was simply a mirror, a reminder of what had been, what had passed, and what had yet to be understood. Rick's fingers adjusted the dials, guiding the static into softer patterns, letting the voice become a gentle hum rather than a roar. He imagined the younger version of himself as a child, eager and naive, building wonders without realizing the unseen consequences. And yet, even in the distance of time and choices, there was a kind of beauty, a purity in not knowing everything, in having the audacity to dream without boundaries. That audacity had brought him to Morty, to their shared moments, to this quiet, humming garage filled with light, memory, and the faint scent of paint and oil. The static deepened, then slowly ebbed, leaving only a quiet resonance, like the fading echo of a song long forgotten. Rick leaned back further, the chair creaking softly under his weight. He looked at Morty's peaceful face, illuminated by the pale glow of the monitors. There was trust there, though unspoken, and a small, immense understanding. The boy had grown amidst chaos, neglect, guidance, and care, and yet remained intact, warm, and whole. Rick realized that sometimes listening, truly listening, even to a version of oneself trapped in static, could teach more than any lecture. Experiment or invention, he thought about all the universes he had built, all the chaos he had sown, and all the lessons he had left unsaid. The static whispered again, softer this time, as if the universe itself leaned closer to hear. Rick closed his eyes, letting it all wash over him. The younger voice, the hum of machinery, the faint heartbeat of the garage and the quiet rhythm of Morty's breathing intertwined. They became one fabric of understanding, of limits, of love, of the quiet ways one could care without ever speaking a word. Hours passed, though time seemed irrelevant here. The hum of the machine softened to a lull, the static fading into an almost imperceptible whisper. Rick felt a gentle release, as though the weight of countless years, choices and regrets had lifted slightly. He realized that being present, being silent, and listening to both Morty and the echoes of himself was more profound than any invention or interdimensional conquest. The voice in the static finally dissolved, leaving only a memory of sound, an imprint on the mind, and a quiet warmth in the chest. Rick sat still, absorbing the peace that lingered. Aware that some lessons required no action, only attention, Morty turned in his sleep, nestling slightly closer, and Rick allowed his hand to rest on the cot's edge, a silent acknowledgement, a gesture of care without expectation. The garage was alive with quiet resonance, memory, and understanding, a space where past and present intertwined without pressure or urgency. Rick exhaled softly, letting the hum of the room and the fading echoes of the young Rick's voice lull him into a calm he had not felt in decades. The weight of unspoken words, the fragments of regret and the distant glimmers of pride now coexisted peacefully, woven into the gentle rhythm of the night. And in this quiet, infinite moment, Rick understood that some truths are not to be solved or declared, but simply listened to, embraced, and left to drift gently into memory. The stars outside the garage glimmered faintly through the cracks of the ceiling, and Rick felt the vastness of all that had been, and all that might yet come fold softly into the present. The hum of the garage, the static's fading echo, and Morty's even breathing became a lullaby of understanding. Patience and love expressed not through words, but through presence. In that soft, lingering calm, Rick allowed himself to be still, fully attentive and wholly at peace. The stars outside stretched across the void like threads of silver silk, unbroken and silent. Rick guided the spaceship home with steady hands, each movement precise, measured, almost reverent. The hum of the engines was a soft, constant heartbeat beneath the cabin, a gentle reminder of motion, of life, of the slow passage of time. Morty lay beside him on a narrow bench, curled in a blanket that smelled faintly of the cosmos and of home, breathing in a rhythm that was both steady and fragile, as if the universe itself had synchronized with his slumber. The dim light from the control panels painted Rick's face in gentle shades of blue and violet, casting soft shadows that softened the edges of worry, regret, and unspoken words. For once Rick did not speak. Words had been heavy lately, laden with attempts to explain what he himself barely understood. Instead, he allowed the silence to fill the cabin, letting the rhythmic thrumming of the ship become a lullaby. Each star they passed seemed to wink in quiet acknowledgement, faint echoes of moments long past. Car rides and small victories, quiet laughter, and the sound of Morty's voice saying something that didn't need to be understood, only remembered. The universe outside seemed vast, infinite and yet comforting in its constancy. Time moved differently in the quiet of space, slower, gentler, forgiving of all the missteps and hurried decisions that had shaped them both. Rick's hand rested lightly near Morty's shoulder, hesitant to intrude yet wanting to be close, to convey the weight of care in the absence of words. He traced the outline of the cot, memorizing the way Morty shifted in sleep, the soft rise and fall of his chest. A memory flitted across Rick's mind. The first time he had built a safe space for Morty in some distant dimension, the small planet constructed from curiosity and hope. It had been imperfect, fragile, and yet it had held joy just as this quiet journey did now. In that memory, Rick had understood that protection was not about perfection, but about presence, about being there even when the world threatened chaos. Outside the window, a comet streaked across the sky, leaving a soft trail of light that lingered longer than the eye expected. Rick smiled faintly, not with amusement, but with a recognition of the continuity of things, the persistence of beauty even in fleeting forms. Morty murmured something in his sleep, a half-formed word that could have been a question or a dream, and Rick imagined it as a message from the universe itself. Gentle, unassuming, yet filled with meaning for those willing to notice. He realized then that parenting, even in its most abstract cosmic form, was not about control or correction, but about these quiet exchanges of presence. The invisible threads that connect hearts across space and time. Rick allowed his thoughts to drift to all the things he had tried to fix in his life. Machines, timelines, universes, mistakes both large and infinitesimal. Yet as he watched Morty sleep, it occurred to him that some of the most important work he had done could not be measured, calculated, or perfected. It existed only in moments like this: steady breathing, shared silence, and a hand resting near a loved one without expectation. For the first time in decades, the weight of genius and regret seemed to ease, replaced by a warmth that was quiet, tender, and wholly unassuming. The stars outside the cockpit shimmered faintly, reflecting off the glass like memories refracted through time. Rick traced the constellations with his eyes, each light a reminder of choices made, roads not taken and lessons quietly absorbed. In the distance, planets drifted slowly, some familiar, some distant echoes of adventures long past. He considered the journey of parenthood, the way it had warped and stretched across universes, shaping both himself and Morty in ways neither could articulate. And yet, in the simplicity of this return voyage, he understood the path had been meaningful, not because of grandeur or accomplishment, but because of attention, care, and the quiet recognition of shared life. Morty shifted slightly, a small smile playing across his lips even in sleep. Rick allowed himself a rare, unguarded moment of tenderness, the kind that did not require explanation or justification. He thought of the voice in the static from nights past, of the young Rick unaware of consequence, and realized that the man he had been and the man he had become coexisted within him now. The past, present, and infinite possibilities seemed to fold gently into the quiet rhythm of the spaceship, creating a space where memory, care, and love were tangible, felt as acutely as any physical presence. Rick allowed the ship to glide silently through the void, the hum of the engines and the soft flicker of starlight becoming a lullaby in themselves. He thought of the times he had failed, the times he had hurried, the moments of absence that had left quiet gaps between him and Morty, and yet the boy's presence beside him, calm, trusting, and steady, filled all the spaces he had feared would remain empty. It was a realization of depth and patience, of understanding that love could manifest not in grand gestures or explanations, but in being present, undistracted, and wholly attentive. The vastness of space became a mirror for the quiet growth that had occurred over countless adventures, mistakes, and cosmic mishaps. Rick realized that home was not a place or a machine, but the intersection of shared experiences, attentive presence, and the trust given freely by someone willing to be seen. Morty, in sleep, embodied that trust, and Rick finally let himself recognize that it was enough. It was more than enough. Hours seemed to pass without urgency, measured only by the subtle shifts in star patterns and the soft hum of the spaceship. Rick's mind wandered gently through memories, allowing the lessons of time and love to seep slowly into understanding. Every decision, every failure, every unspoken word had led to this quiet voyage, this delicate shared moment of stillness and recognition. He understood, with the clarity that only comes when all pretenses are set aside, that sometimes the most profound guidance is silent, unassuming and steady. As the ship drew closer to home, the glow of familiar lights appeared faintly on the horizon, signs of Earth, of family, of ordinary life intertwined with extraordinary memories. Rick exhaled slowly, feeling the night, the stars, and the soft rhythm of breathing around him settle into a kind of quiet, comfortable continuity. He did not move his hand closer, nor did he speak, but allowed the calm to envelope them both, a shared serenity that transcended words. And in the gentle, drifting glow of the cockpit, with stars folding silently around them, Rick understood the weight of presence, the importance of attention and the quiet, profound ways love reveals itself in patience, calm, and shared time. The lab was quiet, filled with the faint hum of old machinery that had long since ceased to serve their intended purpose. Light from a single overhead lamp painted the room in muted golds and blues, stretching shadows across the walls in gentle, slow shapes. Rick moved among the benches and scattered tools with careful deliberation, his fingers brushing over instruments that had once torn through dimensions, bending time and space, yet now seemed to hum with a softer resonance. This was not a night for experiments meant to save universes or rewrite history. Tonight the purpose was smaller, gentler, intimate, almost invisible. Rick was building something that could not be measured in outcomes, only in feelings. Morty watched from the corner, tucked into a chair with a blanket wrapped around him like a protective cocoon. He had learned to remain silent during moments like these, understanding that his grandfather's quiet focus was both fragile and profound. He observed Rick assembling tiny components, delicate wires twisting like the threads of forgotten lullabies, soft gears that clicked quietly, harmonizing with the steady breathing of the room. The device took shape slowly, a small box no bigger than a lunch container, with a softly glowing orb embedded in its center. Its glow pulsed in rhythm with the quiet hum. A gentle heartbeat mirrored in the lamp's light. Rick paused often, adjusting a connection here, nudging a lens there, as if listening to the machine rather than actively controlling it. Each pause was a conversation between mind and object, a negotiation of subtle intention. He remembered countless inventions built to impress, to dominate, to traverse impossible dimensions. None of them carried the weight of meaning this one did. This creation was designed to hold quiet moments, to cradle solitude, and to whisper presence into the spaces of a restless mind. He thought of Morty, of his vulnerabilities, of the nights when sleep had been impossible and the universe felt heavy. The device was for that, to comfort, to reassure, to create an invisible bridge between loneliness and awareness of care. Morty, ever observant, noticed how Rick's expression softened as he worked. The usual flickers of impatience, irritation, or distance were replaced by a rare, serene concentration. There was a humility in his movements, a recognition that not all problems could be solved with intellect or daring. Some required only attentiveness, patience, and the willingness to give attention without expectation. The device itself seemed to embody these qualities, a gentle echo of Rick's understanding that love need not always be loud, grand, or immediate. Sometimes, it existed simply in presence and intent. Hours passed in the timeless manner of a room steeped in quiet creation. Rick adjusted the final components, testing circuits that seemed to respond to invisible pulses of thought and emotion. He spoke softly to himself at intervals. Words meant more for focus than communication. This one matters in ways that matter most. Morty watched, absorbing the care in the rhythm of motion, understanding intuitively that this act was as much for Rick as it was for him, a shared legacy of attention, vulnerability, and love. When the device was complete, Rick placed it on a small pedestal, its light faint but steady. He leaned back, allowing himself a moment to observe, to breathe, to feel the weight of accomplishment, not in discovery or domination, but in the creation of comfort. Morty, moved by the quiet significance, hesitated before asking what it was. Rick merely smiled, the kind of smile that carried years of regret, hope, and care, and gestured toward the glowing orb. "It hums when someone feels alone," he said softly. "Not just for you, for anyone who needs to hear that they're remembered, that they're noticed." Morty, sensing the gravity behind the simplicity, nodded and walked closer, his small hand hovering over the orb's soft glow. He felt warmth radiate from it, a subtle vibration like the heartbeat of someone who understood you completely without words. Rick watched his grandson, noting how the boy's face softened in reflection, eyes closed as if absorbing not just the device's hum, but the sentiment it carried, the silent promise that even in absence, presence could persist. The two sat together in the dim light, side by side, listening to the small, steady pulse of the invention. Rick considered the years of chaos, the misadventures and the moments of silence that had defined their relationship. He thought of the nights when he had failed to explain, when his genius had overshadowed his empathy, and when he had inadvertently left Morty to navigate uncertainty alone. Yet here in this small act of creation, there was redemption not through words, but through attentiveness, care, and intention. Rick found himself reflecting on the nature of all his inventions, those that traversed time, shifted reality or bent the rules of existence, and recognized a pattern. The most meaningful creations were not the ones that altered the universe, but the ones that touched hearts, that bridged gaps between minds and souls, that comforted when silence otherwise reigned. This device was a culmination of that understanding, a testament not to power, but to presence, not to genius, but to love measured in attention, not in achievements. As Morty finally rose to leave the lab, carrying the small humming device to his room, Rick lingered, gazing at the faint glow. It was a gentle ending to a night of creation, a soft punctuation to years of loud, chaotic endeavors. He felt a sense of stillness, the rare calm that comes not from controlling the world, but from quietly contributing to someone else's sense of security and wonder. He understood, as he often had tried but failed to articulate, that this was what it meant to care, to build, to attend, to offer comfort without expectation, and to know that some forms of love are most profound when silent. Outside, the universe continued its endless drift, stars blinking faintly in acknowledgement of a quiet act. Inside the lab, the hum of the device merged with the subtle breathing of two beings who had traversed chaos, sorrow, and joy together. And in that combined rhythm, human, cosmic, and tender, the story of creation and care reached a delicate apex, a moment of serenity that required no explanation, only presence, only acknowledgement. The room eventually fell into deeper silence, the device continuing its soft, persistent hum, a beacon for any heart that might feel alone. Rick finally stood, leaning back against the workbench, eyes closing briefly in an uncharacteristic expression of peace. Morty's footsteps receded, and yet the warmth of shared understanding lingered, a faint, enduring echo like stars in a night sky, a constant, gentle, and impossible to forget. The chapter closes on that quiet resonance, the invention humming softly in the background, a symbol of attentive love and enduring presence, a preparation for the final chapter, where memory, reflection, and quiet light converge into the story's gentle exhale. The garage was bathed in the soft glow of the final creation, the lullaby device pulsing quietly, like a heart keeping time with invisible thoughts. Outside, night stretched across the world, a tapestry of deep indigo and scattered stars, each one blinking faintly as though acknowledging the quiet reverence inside. Rick stood in the corner, hands tucked into his coat pockets, watching the gentle radiance. The hum of the machine filled the space like a tender whisper, threading through the air and mingling with the memories that lingered in the corners of the room, echoes of laughter, soft scoldings, and the occasional fleeting words of pride that had never been spoken aloud. Morty had gone to bed hours ago, the small device now resting on his nightstand, glowing just enough to provide comfort without disturbing sleep. Rick allowed himself to linger, tracing the contours of familiar tools, the edges of consoles that had once erupted with sparks and chaos. Each object told a story, each hum a fragment of time spent navigating infinite possibilities. Yet tonight those stories felt gentle, a quiet catalogue of care rather than invention. For the first time in decades, the room felt more like home than lab, a sanctuary carved out not from science, but from attention, intention, and the subtle act of remaining present. He walked slowly to the workbench where the device had been completed, touching it lightly as if it were more fragile than the worlds he had bent to his will. This device, unlike the rest, was immune to destruction, immune to failure in the conventional sense. Its purpose was not to conquer, nor to manipulate, nor to traverse dimensions. Its purpose was to comfort, to remind, to exist as a beacon of care when silence otherwise reigned. Rick felt the weight of that significance settle on him like a quiet snowfall, soft and deliberate, filling the empty spaces left by years of chaos. Memories drifted through him, the first time he had noticed Morty's eyes widen in wonder, the small victories no one else had witnessed, the nights spent silently repairing both the ship and the gaps between them. He remembered the broken star in the drawer, the jars of laughter, and the quiet mornings where pancakes burned but affection remained. Every fragment of love he had failed to articulate now coalesced into this one soft rhythm, the gentle pulse of the lullaby device, a symbol of the quiet constellations that parenthood had drawn across his life. Rick's gaze shifted to the walls, lined with inventions that had once promised grandeur. He could almost hear them sigh, as if acknowledging the quieter power of the act he had chosen instead. There was no portal to another dimension tonight, no device to outwit, no science to prove. There was only this hum, steady and tender, echoing the rhythm of lives intertwined through struggle, curiosity, and care. He thought of Morty sleeping just down the hall, of Beth's quiet orbit, and even of the echoes of universes that had once demanded his attention. All of it now felt softer, as if the light of memory itself had become a blanket, enveloping him, guiding him, reminding him that love persists even when unspoken. He walked slowly to the doorway, peering into the night that seemed heavier with quiet than any chaos he had ever unleashed. Each star outside blinked in a slow, deliberate cadence, a mirrored rhythm to the pulse within the garage. Rick allowed himself a breath, deep and unhurried, savoring the sensation of peace that had arrived not with triumph, but with reflection. He noticed the small things, the subtle gleam of a tool's edge, the way shadows leaned across the floor, the way light refracted through glass to catch faint sparkles of dust. The world outside continued its imperceptible spin, yet inside every heartbeat seemed to stretch, intimate and eternal. Rick returned to the bench and touched the device once more, feeling its warmth seep into his hands. He recalled each quiet moment that had led him here, the failed experiments that taught humility, the words left unsaid that taught patience, the gentle presence of a child who had grown alongside him. It all converged in this soft light, a quiet testament to attention given and received, a reflection of care in its purest, most unassuming form. The room hummed along, a lullaby for those willing to pause and listen, a gentle pulse bridging the past, present, and future. He leaned back in a chair, closing his eyes for a fleeting instant, absorbing the sensation of quiet triumph. Not the thrill of discovery, but the profound serenity of knowing that something enduring, something compassionate had been crafted for someone else. A moment of soft surrender, acknowledging that the world could continue to turn, galaxies could drift apart, and yet some forms of connection remain unbroken. Rick let the hum settle into his mind like a gentle tide, carrying away echoes of restlessness and leaving behind the calm clarity of presence. The garage, filled with dim light and the hum of the device, was now a sanctuary of memory and care. Rick's thoughts drifted outward, past the walls, past the streets, past the sleeping forms of his family, toward the expanse of stars beyond. He realized that love, when quiet and intentional, can ripple farther than any invention, bridging distances both literal and emotional. He allowed himself to sit in that awareness, letting the pulse of the small device sync with the pulse of the world. A slow, gentle affirmation that attention and kindness endure beyond words. Finally, Rick stood and walked to the window, peering at the sky as it stretched toward infinity. The stars seemed to pulse in tandem with the device, echoing the quiet cadence of the love and care that had threaded itself through years of chaos and discovery. The night was soft, infinite, and patient, as if the universe itself understood the importance of small acts sustained over time. He allowed a faint smile, one unburdened by expectation, to curve his lips. The lab, the device, the hum, the memories, all existed now as a quiet testament, a final arrangement of light and intention. The garage's hum softened, the light steady and persistent, a beacon for anyone who might need it. Rick remained in the room for a final moment, letting the resonance fill every corner. Then slowly he allowed himself to step back, leaving the light on, leaving the quiet presence of care to linger, unspoken, enduring, and profound.